Selection 1. The hook she has a tomb at Abydos. Not a small tomb, not the modest burial of a courtier or a consort who happened to die near the royal necropolis. A full royal tomb, in the cemetery where the pharaohs of the First Dynasty were buried. The same cemetery that holds the tombs of Nama, Aha, Djet and Den, laid out on exactly the same scale as the other royal burials, surrounded by the subsidiary graves of retainers who were killed at the time of burial to accompany the person interred into the afterlife. The retainer count runs to approximately 41 subsidiary graves around her own burial, a number that places her firmly within the same institutional tradition of royal funerary practice as the male First Dynasty pharaohs buried beside her. She has a second funerary monument at Saqqara, a cenotaph, or perhaps a mortuary complex in its own right, on the plateau where the great administrative officials and court figures of the First Dynasty also built their elaborate mastaba tombs. The Saqqara monument is substantial. Substantial enough that when Flinders Petrie excavated it in the 1890s CE, he initially identified it as the tomb of a king, not of a woman. He was not wrong about the status of the person it honoured. He was only uncertain about the gender. Her name appears on the formal administrative records of the Egyptian state, specifically on a series of clay seal impressions found in both tombs that bear the title King's Mother alongside her name, but that also, in certain examples, appear to show her name enclosed in the serek, the palace facade enclosure topped with the Horus falcon that was the specific graphic device reserved for the names of ruling pharaohs. The evidence is fragmentary, it is contested. It has generated more than a century of scholarly debate about whether Merneith was simply the mother of a king or something more, whether she was, for some period of time, the ruler of Egypt in her own right. Her name means beloved of Neith, a dedication to the ancient goddess of the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, the warrior goddess of hunting and weaving, one of the most powerful divine presences in the early Egyptian theological tradition. It is a name that reflects a specific connection to a specific regional and theological tradition, the connection that would eventually make the city of Sais the capital of the last great native Egyptian dynasty, the 26th dynasty, 2,500 years after Merneith's death. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Merneith was, but what the specific evidence for her authority reveals about the nature of power in the early Egyptian state, about the specific mechanisms by which women could hold and exercise royal authority in a civilization that is often imagined as having been exclusively governed by men, and about why the story of the first woman to hold the highest power in Egypt has been systematically obscured, minimized, and debated for the entire period since the evidence for her existence was first recovered from the desert. Let that sink in. Approximately 4,900 years ago, a woman governed one of the most powerful and most institutionally sophisticated states in the ancient world. The evidence for it is in the ground at Abydos. The evidence has been there since the First Dynasty, and for most of the past century and a quarter since the evidence was recovered, the scholarly and popular response has been to debate it, qualify it, contextualize it, and resist the most direct interpretation of what it shows. The time for resistance is over. The evidence is clear enough. Before we get started, if you find these stories as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. The resistance has come in many forms. The argument that the Serek appearances of her name are misreadings of the evidence. The argument that the title King's Mother was her only formal status and that everything else is speculation. The argument that the extraordinary quality and the extraordinary scale of her tomb at Abydos can be explained without recourse to the interpretation that she held royal authority. The argument that the First Dynasty was too thoroughly patrilineal in its succession practices to have permitted a woman to rule, and therefore any evidence that appears to show female rule must be reinterpreted in a way consistent with this prior assumption. Each of these arguments has been made, in various forms, by various scholars across the century and more since the evidence for Merneith's existence and her authority was recovered, and each of them has been answered in various forms by other scholars who have looked at the same evidence and drawn different conclusions. What this account argues is not a simple reversal of the scholarly debate, not the claim that all uncertainty is resolved and that Merneith was definitively the ruling pharaoh of Egypt in the full sense of the later royal tradition. The evidence genuinely does not allow complete certainty. What this account argues is that the most direct reading of the available evidence, the reading that does not begin from the prior assumption that a woman cannot have held royal authority in the First Dynasty, supports the interpretation that Merneith exercised real governing power, whether her specific formal title was pharaoh in the strict later sense, or something functionally equivalent. And it argues that the specific pattern of resistance to this interpretation, the systematic tendency to minimize, qualify, and work around the evidence for female royal authority in the early period, is itself a historical phenomenon worth examining because it tells us something important about the specific ways in which the history of women's power has been told and untold across the long history of Egyptological scholarship. The evidence for Merneith, the story of what the evidence shows, and the story of how the evidence has been received. All three of these are the subject of this account. The tomb at Abydos is real, the seal impressions are real, the subsidiary burials are real, the cenotaph at Saqqara is real, and the woman to whom all of this evidence points, the woman who governed Egypt in the last decades of the 3rd millennium BC, whose son Den would become the most administratively innovative pharaoh of the First Dynasty, whose own authority seems to have bridged the reign of her husband and the reign of her son in exactly the way that a regent would. That woman is real too. Her name was Merneith, and her story begins now. So section 2, Altation and Kill. To understand Merneith, you need to understand the world she inhabited. And the world she inhabited was the world of the early First Dynasty of Egypt, approximately 4,900 years ago, in the period roughly 4 or 5 generations after the unification of the Egyptian state under its first pharaoh. This was the world that this series has examined in detail in the accounts of Den and Kasekemwe, the world of the royal necropolis at Abydos, the world of the developing administrative apparatus of the unified Egyptian state, the world of the ivory labels and the cylinder seals and the elaborate funerary complexes that were the primary material expressions of the early pharaonic ideology. It was a world in which the specific forms of the Egyptian civilization were still being worked out, in which the institutions, the symbolic vocabulary, the administrative practices, and the royal ideology that would define the tradition for the next 3,000 years were all in active development rather than fully established. Merneith was a participant in that development, not a passive participant, a figure who simply happened to be present at the court while the men around her made the important decisions, but an active, institutionally central participant whose specific position at a specific critical moment of dynastic transition gave her a degree of authority over the Egyptian state that the surviving evidence reflects in multiple categories of material evidence. The specific moment of her authority was the transition between the reign of her apparent husband, Djet, the 4th pharaoh of the First Dynasty, and the reign of her apparent son, Den, the 5th pharaoh. The death of Djet and the accession of Den created a specific succession problem that the early Egyptian royal tradition had not fully developed the institutional mechanisms to manage. The problem of a succession in which the heir was too young to govern independently, requiring some form of regency or co-governance to maintain the institutional functioning of the state during the period of transition. Merneith appears to have been the solution to this problem, as the Queen of Djet and the Mother of Den, as the woman who connected the two successive reigns through her own person and her own specific institutional position. She was the specific figure best placed to exercise the governing authority of the state during the period when the heir was not yet capable of doing so himself. Whether this exercise of governing authority was formally recognized in the same way that a male pharaoh's authority was formally recognized. Whether her name in the Serek is a genuine pharaonic title or simply a mark of honor associated with the specific institutional role of the royal mother. is the specific scholarly question at the center of the Merneith debate. But the exercise of the authority itself is not seriously in question. The evidence for it is too substantial and too varied to dismiss. The discovery of that evidence, the specific moment when modern scholarship first encountered the material basis for the story of Merneith, came in the last years of the 19th century CE during the systematic excavation of the Abydos royal necropolis by Flinders Petrie. Petrie arrived at Abydos in 1899 CE, as described in the account of Den in this series, with the specific mission of recovering what systematic archaeology could still recover from the site after Amelineau's earlier and less methodologically rigorous excavations. He was working against a background of already disturbed contexts, carefully sifting through the debris of both the ancient looting and the recent excavation to find the objects and the contextual information that could still be recovered. In the area of the royal necropolis, Petrie identified the sequence of the First Dynasty royal tombs, the tombs of the kings whose names appeared on the ivory labels, and the seal impressions he was recovering, and established the basic, chronological framework of the early period that subsequent scholarship would refine and elaborate. Among the tombs he identified was a large burial complex that did not fit neatly into the sequence of male pharaonic burials. A tomb of unmistakably royal scale and character, surrounded by the subsidiary burials that were the specific feature of First Dynasty royal funerary practice, but associated with a name that was not on the established list of First Dynasty kings. The name was Merneith, and the tomb was hers. Petrie's initial interpretation of the tomb was that it belonged to a king. The scale, the subsidiary burials, the quality of the objects associated with it all pointed to royalty. But the name Merneith was recognizably female in its grammatical construction. The feminine form of the dedicatory name pattern that Egyptian nomenclature used, and the objects associated with the tomb, including the seal impressions that bore her name alongside the title King's Mother, created a complex picture that Petrie and subsequent scholars struggled to interpret coherently. The scholarly response to the Merneith tomb in the decades immediately following its discovery reflected the specific intellectual context of the late 19th and early 20th century academic world, a context in which the assumption that significant historical authority was exercised by men was so deeply embedded in the scholarly framework that evidence pointing in a different direction was systematically interpreted through the lens of that assumption. The argument went something like this. The tomb must be a royal tomb, because only royalty received this treatment. But the tomb belongs to a woman with the title King's Mother, not king. Therefore, the explanation must be that the king's mother held some special honorific status that explained her royal scale, burial without requiring the interpretation that she actually governed. The specific evidence for her name in the Sareka was either explained away as a misreading, or interpreted as a later honorific addition, or acknowledged but characterized as an unusual exception to the normal pattern, rather than as evidence that the normal pattern was itself more varied than the standard narrative assumed. This pattern of interpretation, the accommodation of inconvenient evidence within an existing framework, rather than the revision of the framework in response to the evidence, is a recognizable feature of intellectual conservatism in any scholarly tradition, and it is worth naming explicitly because it has shaped the specific way that Merneith's story has been told across the century and more since her tomb was first excavated. The Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson, whose comprehensive treatment of the early dynastic period provides the most authoritative modern overview of the First Dynasty, characterized the Merneith debate as one of the most persistent and most instructive examples of the specific way in which prior assumptions about gender and power can shape the interpretation of archaeological evidence. Wilkinson's own position, carefully argued and thoroughly evidenced, is that Merneith most likely held genuine governing authority during the period of Den's minority, and that the evidence for this interpretation is sufficient to treat it as the most plausible available reconstruction of her status, even if it cannot be established with a kind of certainty that written records in a mature script would allow. This account follows Wilkinson's assessment, but it does so with a specific additional argument that the resistance to the Merneith interpretation is itself part of the story, and that understanding the resistance illuminates something important about how the history of the ancient world has been told, and how the full story of that world's complexity, including complexity of gender and power in the earliest literate civilization, requires the specific willingness to follow the evidence where it leads, rather than accommodating it within prior assumptions. The evidence leads to Merneith. It has been leading there for more than a century. This account follows it to its conclusion. The specific institutional context in which Merneith exercised her authority requires more detailed examination, because it is the specific institutional context, the specific character of the early First Dynasty state, and its specific approach to the management of succession that makes her authority both understandable and historically significant. The early First Dynasty was, as described in the account of Den in this series, a state in the process of developing its administrative forms. The organizational apparatus, the nome system, the administrative labels, the standardized administrative records, was being built out under precisely the rulers whose reigns framed Merneith's period of authority. Djet had been the fourth pharaoh, and Den the fifth. The transitions between their reigns occurred in a period when the specific mechanisms of royal succession were still being worked out. In a state whose succession practices were still developing, the specific problem of a young heir and a potential interregnum was particularly acute. The early Egyptian royal tradition had not yet developed the specific legal and administrative infrastructure. The formal regency system, the recognized categories of co-regency, the institutional mechanisms for managing the transition of royal authority that later periods of Egyptian history would have available. The problem of succession was solved in the early period primarily through the specific personal and family relationships of the royal household, rather than through formal institutional mechanisms. Merneith's authority was, in this context, the solution to a specific institutional problem: the need to maintain the governing authority of the Egyptian state during the period when the heir was too young to exercise it independently. Her position as the mother of the heir, as the woman who embodied the dynastic continuity between the deceased Djet and the young Den, made her the specific person best placed to exercise that authority in the absence of formal institutional mechanisms for managing the transition. This specific type of authority, the authority exercised by the mother of a young heir during the period of his minority, is a recognizable institutional form across many ancient and medieval societies. It is the authority of the Queen Regent, the woman who governs not in her own name but on behalf of her son, who exercises the full practical authority of the state, while maintaining the formal fiction that the authority ultimately belongs to the heir. Whether Merneith's authority was understood in these terms by the people who were subject to it, whether her role was conceived as a regency, as a co-rulership, or as something that the early Egyptian institutional vocabulary did not yet have a precise category for, is a question that the surviving evidence cannot fully answer. What the evidence does show is that the authority she exercised was real, that it was recognized in the administrative documentation of the state, and that it was commemorated in her burial with the full institutional treatment accorded to the rulers of Egypt. The scale of that institutional treatment is itself the most important single piece of evidence for the nature of her authority, and it deserves careful attention. The tomb at Abydos, designated Tomb Y in the scholarly literature, as the convention for labeling the early royal tombs assigns letter designations, is located in the main royal cemetery of the First Dynasty, the specific area known as el-Kab, Mother of Pots, where the pottery sherds left by generations of ancient pilgrims who visited the site in later periods have given the location its modern name. The tombs of the First Dynasty pharaohs, Nama, Aha, Djet, Den, Ka, are clustered in this area, each one a substantial underground structure of mud brick, divided into rooms, covered with wooden roofing, and sealed at the completion of the burial. Merneith's tomb is in this cluster, not adjacent to it, not near it. In it, among the royal tombs, indistinguishable in its basic structural character and its basic scale from the other royal tombs around it. The subsidiary burials that surround her tomb are the most viscerally powerful piece of evidence for her status. Subsidiary burials, the practice of killing and burying the retainers of the deceased alongside the main burial, were, as described in the account of Den, one of the most specifically royal features of the First Dynasty funerary tradition. Not every high-status burial included subsidiary graves. The subsidiary burial tradition was most consistently and most extensively associated with the royal burial specifically. It was the expression of the specific ideology of the divine king's continuing need for service in the afterlife, and it was most fully expressed in the context of the royal funerary program. Merneith's tomb has approximately 41 subsidiary graves. These are not small, simple burials. They are the graves of specific individuals, each in their own pit, buried with the specific care and the specific grave goods that reflected the institutional seriousness with which the funerary program treated the people who were killed to serve the deceased. 41 subsidiary graves in the royal cemetery, arranged around the main burial in the same pattern as the subsidiary graves of the male pharaohs buried nearby. The math is striking. Djet, her apparent husband, had approximately 174 subsidiary graves. Den, her apparent son, had approximately 137. The numbers for the other First Dynasty pharaohs vary, but they are all in the range of dozens to hundreds. Merneith's 41 is at the lower end of this range, consistent with the subsidiary grave counts of some of the less extensively served First Dynasty kings, but it is unambiguously in the same institutional category as the royal burials. No non-royal burial in the First Dynasty had subsidiary graves in this number. The subsidiary burial tradition was a royal prerogative. The fact that Merneith's burial has it at this scale is the most direct single piece of evidence for her royal status. The German Egyptologist Eva Maria Engel, whose systematic analysis of the Abydos Royal Cemetery has produced the most comprehensive recent reassessment of the First Dynasty tombs and their inhabitants, described the Merneith burial as unambiguously royal in its structural and institutional character. Engel's work at the Abydos site, part of the continuing German Archaeological Institute excavation program that has been working at the site since Petrie's time, has produced new material evidence that strengthens rather than weakens the case for Merneith's royal status. The specific new evidence includes additional seal impressions bearing her name in configurations that are consistent with royal administrative practice. The use of the name on the kinds of administrative seals that were employed in the management of the royal estates and the royal administrative apparatus. If Merneith was simply a honoured queen mother with a royal-scale burial, but no governing authority, the specific administrative seal evidence would be harder to explain. Why would a figure with purely honorific status be associated with the administrative apparatus of the state in the specific way that the seal evidence suggests? The answer that the evidence most directly supports is the answer that this account is arguing for. That Merneith was not simply a honoured queen mother. She was the effective governing authority of the Egyptian state during the specific period of transition between Djet's death and Den's establishment of independent rule. Her name on administrative seals is the evidence for the governing function. Her tomb at Abydos is the evidence for the institutional recognition of that function. The subsidiary burials are the evidence for the royal scale of the honouring that function received. Together, these three categories of evidence, the administrative seals, the royal tomb, the subsidiary burials, constitute a case that is as strong as the fragmentary documentary record of the early First Dynasty allows any case to be. Not certain, not proved in the sense that a mature writing system producing full linguistic records would allow, but strong. Strong enough to be the most plausible reconstruction of who Merneith was and what she did. That reconstruction is what this account now develops in the detail it deserves. The broader context of women's power in the ancient Egyptian world deserves explicit attention here because Merneith's story is not an isolated anomaly. It is the earliest clearly evidenced example of a pattern that recurs throughout Egyptian history, and that needs to be understood on its own terms rather than as an exception to a norm of exclusively male rule. The Egyptian royal tradition accommodated female authority in several specific institutional forms across its 3,000-year history. The queen consort, the wife of the ruling pharaoh, held a specific institutional position that could, under the right circumstances, become a governing position. The queen mother, the mother of the ruling pharaoh, particularly when the pharaoh was a minor, could exercise the practical authority of the state through the specific institutional form of the regency. The co-regent, a person appointed to share the royal authority with the ruling pharaoh, could be a woman, though this was rarer. And, in the most extreme cases, a woman could simply be recognized as the ruling pharaoh herself, with the full titulary and the full institutional apparatus of the pharaonic tradition. The most famous examples of the latter, the fully recognized female pharaoh, are Hatshepsut in the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, approximately 1400 years after Merneith, and Cleopatra VII at the very end of the Ptolemaic period, approximately 2000 years after Merneith. Both of these figures have received substantial scholarly and popular attention. Both are well documented in the surviving evidence. Both have been subjects of sustained scholarly analysis that has established the specific character of their authority and its institutional expression. Merneith predates both of them by more than 1,000 years in Hatshepsut's case, and by more than 2,000 in Cleopatra's. She is, by any reasonable reconstruction of the evidence, the earliest clearly evidenced female holder of the Egyptian royal authority, and her story has received a fraction of the attention that either of her more famous successors has received. This disproportion in attention is partly a function of the evidence. The evidence for Merneith is necessarily more fragmentary than the evidence for Hatshepsut or Cleopatra. The early First Dynasty's limited writing system, the extensive looting of the early royal tombs, and the 3,000 years of subsequent history that have damaged and dispersed the material record all contribute to a situation in which the specific details of Merneith's authority are less completely recoverable than those of the later female rulers. The disproportion in attention is therefore partly justified by the genuine difficulty of the evidence. But the disproportion is also partly a function of the specific character of the scholarly and popular interest in these figures. Cleopatra is famous because she is at the dramatic end of a dynasty, and because her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony make her story fit neatly into the romantic tragic narrative structure that popular history prefers. Hatshepsut is famous partly because of the dramatic story of her erasure by her successor Thutmose III. The specific attempt to remove her from the historical record that the New Kingdom text discusses, which gives her story a specific narrative of suppression and recovery that the popular imagination finds compelling. Merneith's story lacks both of these specific narrative hooks. She was not at a dramatic historical turning point in the same obvious way. Her authority was not dramatically erased by a successor. it was simply under-recognized by subsequent scholarship. Her story is quieter, less immediately dramatic, more dependent on the careful reading of fragmentary material evidence than on the kind of literary and narrative sources that make Hatshepsut and Cleopatra accessible to the popular imagination. But the quiet story is not a less important one. The earliest woman to hold the Egyptian royal authority, to exercise the governing power of the most institutionally sophisticated state in the ancient world at that period, deserves recognition, precisely because her story is quieter, because the recognition of it requires more careful attention to the evidence and more willingness to resist the prior assumptions that have shaped the historical narrative. This account provides both the careful attention and the willingness to resist. The following sections examine the evidence in the detail it deserves, argue the case for the interpretation that the evidence most directly supports, and situate Merneith's story in the broader context of the Egyptian civilizational tradition's relationship to female authority. The case is strong, the story is extraordinary, the woman is real. Her name was Merneith, and the full accounting of what that name means begins now. The specific scale of the challenge involved in reconstructing Merneith's story from the available evidence needs to be made explicit, because the reader who is accustomed to the relatively full documentation available for later periods of Egyptian and world history may underestimate the difficulty of what the available evidence actually permits. The First Dynasty of Egypt falls in the period approximately 3000 to 2900 BC, according to current scholarly estimates. This is more than 2,000 years before the earliest surviving complete written texts in Egyptian, the pyramid texts of the Sixth Dynasty, discussed in the account of Nusere in this series. The writing system that the First Dynasty used was still in its earliest phases of development, capable of recording administrative information, names, and specific categories of institutional data, but not yet capable of the continuous narrative or the complex literary and religious expression that the mature hieroglyphic tradition would eventually produce. This means that the documentary record of the First Dynasty is, by definition, thin. Thin in the sense that the writing system could not yet record the specific kinds of information that would most directly document Merneith's authority. There is no inscription that says, Merneith governed Egypt for X years. There is no administrative text that describes her specific decisions or her specific institutional actions. There is no literary or religious text that describes her specific theological status or her relationship to the divine order. What there is, instead, is the material evidence, the physical objects, the tomb, the seal impressions, the subsidiary burials, the Saqqara monument, whose specific character and specific scale provide indirect but genuine evidence for the nature of the authority they reflect. Reading this material evidence requires the specific skills of the archaeologist and the early period specialist, the ability to interpret physical objects within their specific institutional contexts, to recognize the significance of scale and distribution and institutional association, and to draw reasonable inferences from incomplete data, without overstepping into the territory of unjustified certainty. This account does its best to maintain these standards. It presents the evidence honestly, acknowledges the uncertainty where uncertainty is genuine, and argues for the most plausible interpretation of the evidence, rather than for the interpretation most convenient to a prior narrative. The most plausible interpretation is that Merneith governed Egypt. The evidence for that interpretation is substantial. The uncertainty is about the specific form and the specific extent of her authority, rather than about whether the authority existed at all. With that foundation established, the full examination of the evidence follows. The full examination begins with the discovery of the tomb, with Petrie in the desert at Abydos, the excavation trenches, the emerging evidence of a burial that challenged the existing framework, and then works through the specific categories of evidence that support the interpretation of Merneith as a governing authority, rather than simply a honoured queen mother. The examination is not simple. The evidence is fragmentary, contested, and requires careful contextual interpretation. But the examination is necessary, because the story of the first woman to hold the Egyptian royal authority is a story worth telling in the full complexity it deserves. That telling begins now in the sections that follow. The first woman to hold the Egyptian royal authority, the woman who governed in the gap between her husband's death and her son's majority, the woman whose tomb at Abydos sits in the royal cemetery among the male pharaohs whose institutional equals she was, the woman whose name in the Serek has been debated, qualified, and explained away for more than a century by scholars who found it easier to work around the evidence than to revise their prior assumptions. The revision is long overdue. The evidence deserves its direct reading. The story deserves its full telling. Merneith. The foundation is established. The scale is clear. The following sections examine the evidence in the depth it demands. The depth the evidence demands is significant. A century and more of scholarly work has accumulated around the question of Merneith's status, and this account must engage with that work, acknowledging its contributions, engaging with its arguments, and ultimately arriving at the interpretation that the evidence most directly supports. That engagement is the subject of the following sections, beginning with the specific discovery moment and the specific categories of evidence it produced. The discovery is at Abydos. The evidence is in the ground and in the museum cases. The interpretation is the subject of sustained scholarly debate, and the conclusion, the most plausible reading of the available evidence, is what this account argues, with the full force of everything the scholarly tradition has accumulated and the specific willingness to follow the evidence where it leads. Where it leads is to Merneith. The exploration follows. The exploration follows in full, in the sections that constitute the heart of this account's argument, beginning with the specific moment when the evidence first came to light and the specific challenge it posed to the existing scholarly framework. 4,900 years of history, 125 years of scholarly attention, and a story that deserves the full telling this account now provides. Section 3. The core problem. The core problem of Merneith's story, the problem at the centre of everything this account is attempting to do, is not primarily the historical problem of reconstructing what she did and what authority she held. The historical problem is real and demanding, but it is, in a specific sense, secondary to the deeper problem that her story poses. The deeper problem is the problem of evidence and interpretation. The problem of what to do when the most direct reading of the available evidence leads to a conclusion that challenges prior assumptions about who was capable of holding power in a specific historical context. This is not simply a problem about Merneith. It is a problem about how historical knowledge is constructed, about the specific relationship between evidence and interpretation, between what the material record shows and the frameworks within which that material record is read. The Merneith problem is one of the clearest examples in the entire history of Egyptological scholarship of what happens when the evidence points in a direction that the dominant framework resists. The dominant framework for most of the history of Egyptology as an organized academic discipline assumed that the Egyptian state was governed by men. This assumption was not made explicitly. In most cases, it was rarely stated as a premise that scholars were consciously adopting. It was built into the specific way that questions were asked and interpretations were framed, in the specific tendency to interpret ambiguous evidence in the direction that preserved the assumption rather than in the direction that challenged it. When Petrie found Merneith's tomb in 1899 and identified it as a royal burial associated with a name that was recognizably female, the immediate scholarly response was not to revise the assumption about male governance, but to find an interpretation of the evidence that could accommodate it within the existing framework. The tomb was royal in scale, therefore she must have been a queen of high status. The subsidiary burials were royal in character, therefore she must have received royal burial honours as the mother of a king. The name in the Serek, therefore it must be a misreading, or a later honorific addition, or a special convention that does not have the same meaning as the Serek normally has. Each of these interpretive moves was, individually, not unreasonable. The possibility that a king's mother might receive royal-scale burial honours was genuine. The possibility that a name in the Serech might not always indicate the same thing was genuine. But the pattern of these moves, the systematic tendency to find the interpretation that preserved the assumption rather than the interpretation that challenged it, was itself a form of evidence about the specific character of the scholarly framework within which the Merneith evidence was being interpreted. The core problem, stated directly, is this. For more than a century after the discovery of her tomb, the evidence for Merneith's royal status was systematically interpreted in the least threatening possible direction, the direction that minimized the challenge to the assumption of male governance. And the result was that the most important ancient Egyptian evidence for female royal authority in the early period was consistently presented as less certain, less well-evidenced, and more in need of qualification than the comparable evidence for male royal authority in the same period. Here is the problem in its most specific form. The tomb of Djet, Merneith's apparent husband, is surrounded by approximately 174 subsidiary graves. The tomb of Ka, the last pharaoh of the First Dynasty, is surrounded by approximately 26. The variation in subsidiary grave counts across the First Dynasty royal tombs is wide and does not directly correlate with the length of the reign or the political importance of the ruler. It seems to reflect variations in the specific character of the royal funerary program across different reigns. Merneith's 41 subsidiary graves are, as noted above, at the lower end of the distribution, but clearly within the same institutional category as the other royal burials. If the tomb belonged to a man, the subsidiary burial count of 41 would be straightforwardly interpreted as evidence for royal status. There would be no question. But because the tomb belongs to a woman, the same evidence has been subjected to additional interpretive pressure. The pressure to find a non-royal explanation for a royal-scale burial that would preserve the assumption that the royal burials were exclusively male. This asymmetry, the application of additional interpretive pressure to evidence associated with female status that would not be applied to the same evidence associated with male status, is the specific form of the core problem in the case of Merneith, and it gets worse when you examine the Serech evidence. The Serech, the palace facade enclosure topped with the Horus falcon, was the specific graphic device used to enclose the Horus name of the ruling pharaoh. Its function was clear and consistent across the First Dynasty and subsequent periods. It marked the enclosed name as the name of the ruler. When a name was enclosed in the Serech, it was the ruler's name. This is one of the most reliable conventions of early Egyptian administrative and monumental art. When Merneith's name appears in the Serech on certain seal impressions from her tomb and the Saqqara monument, the most direct reading is that these seal impressions were produced during a period when her name was the ruler's name, when she was, in the specific institutional sense that the Serech marks, the ruling authority. The response to this evidence in the scholarly literature has been, in many cases, to characterize it as ambiguous, uncertain, or in need of additional verification before it can be accepted as evidence for her ruling status. Some scholars have argued that the Serech appearances are misreadings or damage-induced illusions rather than genuine enclosures. Others have argued that the Serech could, in the early period, be used in ways that did not strictly indicate the ruling authority. Others have acknowledged the Serech appearances but characterized them as part of a special honorific treatment that does not constitute genuine evidence for ruling status. Each of these counter-arguments has been engaged by scholars who have examined the original objects and found the Serech appearances to be genuine. Toby Wilkinson, whose examination of the seal impressions is the most systematic in the recent literature, argues that the Serech appearances are real and that they support the interpretation of Merneith as a governing authority. The French Egyptologist Nicolas Grimal, in his comprehensive history of ancient Egypt, describes Merneith as having served as regent for Den during the period of his minority, with the implication that this regency involved the exercise of genuine governing authority. The counter-arguments are not without merit. The early First Dynasty writing system was still developing its conventions, and the specific uses of the Serech in this period were not as strictly standardized as they would later become. It is genuinely possible that the Serek convention was being used in slightly different ways during the very early period, and that the appearance of Merneith's name in the Serek does not straightforwardly mean what the same appearance would mean in a later period. But here is the specific problem with the counterarguments. They are plausible as explanations of why the evidence might not be what it appears to be, but they are not themselves positive evidence for an alternative interpretation. The specific burden of proof, the obligation to provide positive evidence for one's interpretation, rather than simply arguments for why the other interpretation might be wrong, has been applied asymmetrically in the Merneith debate. The case for her royal status has been required to meet a higher standard of evidence than the case against it. And it gets worse still, in a specific and important way. The specific treatment of Merneith's evidence in the scholarly literature is not simply a matter of individual scholars making individual interpretive choices. It reflects a broader pattern in the historiography of ancient Egypt in which the evidence for female authority in the early period is systematically treated as more ambiguous and more in need of qualification than comparable evidence for male authority. The Merneith case is the most prominent example, but it is not the only one. This is not science fiction. This is the specific pattern that feminist scholars of ancient Egypt, most prominently Gay Robbins, whose work on women in ancient Egypt is the foundational modern scholarly treatment of the subject, have documented across several decades of careful analysis of how the evidence for female authority in the Egyptian archaeological record has been interpreted and presented. Robbins described the specific tendency to minimize and qualify evidence for female power as a feature of the scholarly tradition that needed to be named and examined rather than simply continued. This account names it and examines it, and then it proceeds to do what the naming and examining makes possible: the direct reading of the evidence for Merneith's authority, without the prior filter of the assumption that such authority was impossible or exceptional. The direct reading leads to Merneith as governing authority. The evidence supports it. The core problem has been named. But here is what makes this truly fascinating when you consider the full implications. The specific form of the resistance to Merneith's story is itself a form of historical evidence. The history of how her story has been told and not told, accommodated and explained away, is part of the story of how the ancient world's full complexity has been, and continues to be, selectively recovered and selectively presented. Understanding Merneith requires understanding both the ancient evidence and the modern reception of that evidence. Both are part of the full story. The full story follows in the sections that constitute the core of this account. The core problem is named. The examination begins. The specific institutional mechanics of how Merneith's authority would have worked in the early First Dynasty context deserve careful examination, because understanding the institutional context is essential for understanding why her authority was both possible and necessary in the specific circumstances of the Djet Den succession. The early Egyptian state, as described in the accounts of Den and Khafre in this series, was a state in the process of developing its governing institutions. The specific mechanisms by which the state's governing authority was maintained and transmitted were still being worked out. The system of administrative records, the nome system, the administrative titles, the royal titulary, all of these were developing across the First Dynasty in ways that reflected the ongoing institutional development of a newly unified state. In this context, the transition between reigns was a specific moment of institutional vulnerability. The Egyptian state depended, for its functioning, on the continuous exercise of royal authority, on the maintenance of the specific ideological claim that the living Horus was governing the two lands in accordance with the divine order. A gap in that authority, a period in which no credible claimant was exercising it, was a period of institutional danger. The early First Dynasty had not yet developed the specific mechanisms for managing succession that later periods would have available. There was no established succession formula, no formal regency law, no specific legal mechanism for designating a regent and specifying the scope of the regent's authority. These institutional mechanisms would develop across the subsequent history of the Egyptian state, but in the First Dynasty they were not yet present in their developed form. What was present was the specific institutional reality of the royal family, the specific network of personal and family relationships through which the governance of the state was managed in the absence of formal institutional mechanisms, and in that network, the Queen Mother, the woman who was both the widow of the deceased pharaoh and the mother of the designated heir, occupied a position of natural authority that the specific circumstances of the Djet succession made politically decisive. The Queen Mother's institutional position derived from two sources simultaneously. As the widow of the deceased pharaoh, she was the person who had been most intimately connected to the exercise of royal authority during the preceding reign, the person whose daily life had been organized around the governing activity of the court, who knew the specific administrative and political relationships that the governing of the state required, and who had the specific personal knowledge of the court and the officials that the maintenance of the state's functioning demanded. As the mother of the designated heir, she was the person whose interest in the stability of the succession was most directly aligned with the interest of the state, the person who had the most direct personal investment in ensuring that the heir's position was maintained until he was capable of exercising it independently. This combination of institutional knowledge and personal interest in the succession's stability made the Queen Mother the natural governing authority during the period of the heir's minority. She was the specific person who knew how the state worked and who had the strongest personal incentive to maintain its functioning until her son could take over. Merneith's authority was, in this context, not exceptional. It was the natural expression of the institutional position she occupied, the natural consequence of being the Queen Mother of a young heir in a state that had not yet developed formal mechanisms for managing the transition. What was exceptional was the scale and the character of the recognition her authority received. The royal scale tomb at Abydos, the subsidiary burials, the Saqqara monument, the name in the Serek. These were not the institutional markers of an informal authority exercised without official recognition. They were the institutional markers of a formally recognized governing authority, recognized in the same institutional terms as the male pharaonic authority by which it was surrounded. This recognition, formal, institutional, and expressed in the most permanent available medium of the early Egyptian tradition, is the specific thing that makes Merneith's case extraordinary rather than simply natural. Many royal mothers in ancient societies governed informally during the minorities of their sons. Merneith was recognized in the specific institutional forms of the pharaonic tradition as the governing authority of the Egyptian state during the period of Den's minority. That recognition is what the Serek is about, not a misreading, not an honorific convention. The specific formal institutional acknowledgement that she was governing in the specific institutional language of the early Egyptian state, expressed in the most permanent way available to the tradition. The specific question of how long Merneith's governing authority lasted is one that the surviving evidence cannot answer precisely. The length of Den's minority, the specific period between Djet's death and Den's establishment of independent rule, is not documented in any surviving source. Scholarly estimates vary, but the most commonly cited range is somewhere between 5 and 10 years, based on the general range of what a child king's minority period might be expected to last, and the specific evidence for the organizational activities associated with Merneith's authority. 5 to 10 years is a significant period in the life of a state, as organizationally active as the early Egyptian First Dynasty. The administrative records that the Abbasid papyri preserve for the Fifth Dynasty, as described in earlier accounts in this series, are the oldest surviving administrative documents in Egyptian history, but they reflect an administrative tradition that was developing continuously since the First Dynasty. Merneith's authority, exercised across the period of Den's minority, would have required the management of exactly the kinds of administrative activities that the seal impressions from her tomb document. The oversight of the royal estates, the management of the tribute and tax system, the maintenance of the administrative apparatus, that the state's functioning required. She managed it. The seal impressions are the evidence. The administrative titles associated with her name are the evidence. The organizational coherence of the Den reign that followed. Den was the most administratively innovative pharaoh of the First Dynasty, as described in the account of Den in this series, is itself a form of indirect evidence. The administrative apparatus that Den inherited and developed was an apparatus whose functioning had been maintained and advanced during the period of Merneith's authority. The continuity between Merneith's governing period and Den's active rule is not simply a biographical connection. It is an institutional connection. The specific administrative infrastructure, the specific organizational practices, the specific network of officials and relationships that Den would go on to develop into the most sophisticated governing apparatus of the early period. This infrastructure was maintained and developed during Merneith's authority before it was available for Den to advance further. She built the foundation. He built the monument. The pattern is familiar from other accounts in this series. The foundational figure who maintains the conditions within which the more celebrated subsequent achievement becomes possible. The core problem, the problem of evidence and interpretation, of the resistance to the most direct reading of the evidence for female royal authority, is now stated in its full complexity. The following sections examine the specific evidence in the specific detail that the full understanding of Merneith's story requires. The examination is the subject of Section 4. The evidence speaks, the interpretation follows, and the name Merneith, beloved of Neith, the woman who governed Egypt 4,900 years ago, is given its full recognition. The specific relationship between Merneith's authority and the broader question of women's institutional power in the ancient world requires one more layer of examination before the detailed evidence chapters begin, because situating Merneith within the broader history of female governance in the ancient Near East illuminates the specific character of her achievement. The ancient Near East in the third. This specific institutional logic is the key to understanding Merneith's authority. It was not exceptional. It was the application of the same institutional logic that governed succession management across the early ancient Near Eastern world. The logic that recognized the Queen Mother as the natural governing authority during the heir's minority. In the specific context of the early Egyptian First Dynasty state, what was exceptional was the scale and the permanence of the recognition. The royal scale tomb at Abydos, the subsidiary burials, the serek on the seal impressions, the Saqqara monument. These were Egyptian expressions of the specific institutional logic of succession management, and they were expressed in the specific institutional vocabulary of the pharaonic tradition in ways that have left a material record substantial enough for the modern scholar to recover and interpret. Recover and interpret, that is what this account does. The examination follows. The examination that follows is organized around the specific categories of evidence that bear on the question of Merneith's authority. The tomb at Abydos and its specific institutional character, the Saqqara monument and what its scale implies, the seal impressions and the specific administrative evidence they provide, the name in the serek and what it means in the specific institutional context of the early First Dynasty, and the broader patterns of female royal authority in Egyptian history that provide the comparative framework for understanding Merneith's specific case. Each chapter of the exploration section examines one of these categories of evidence in specific detail. Together, they constitute the most comprehensive treatment of the available evidence for Merneith's authority that this account can provide. The examination is not simple. The evidence is fragmentary, and the interpretation requires care, but the direction in which the evidence points is not ambiguous. It points to a woman who governed Egypt, in the gap between her husband's death and her son's majority, with the full institutional recognition of the state she governed. That is the core problem's conclusion. The examination of the evidence that leads to that conclusion begins now. But before the examination begins, one final observation about the core problem's deeper implications. The story of Merneith is not simply a story about one woman who governed Egypt 4,900 years ago. It is a story about the specific relationship between power, gender, and the institutional traditions that accommodate them. The early Egyptian state was, in its specific institutional character, a state organized around the principle of the divine king. The specific claim that the ruler's authority was divine in origin and divine in character, expressed through the specific conventions of the pharaonic tradition. This principle was, in its original formulation, not necessarily gender-specific. The specific divinity of the pharaoh was expressed in the specific role, the maintenance of Mat, the cosmic order, rather than in the specific biological identity of the person occupying the role. The role could, in principle, be occupied by anyone whose connection to the divine tradition was sufficiently strong and sufficiently recognized. What determined whether women could occupy the role was not the principle itself, but the specific institutional traditions through which the principle was expressed. The specific succession, conventions, the specific ritual requirements, the specific social expectations that accumulated across the history of the tradition, and that shaped which individuals were eligible for the pharaonic role in any given period. In the early First Dynasty, these traditions were still developing. The succession conventions were not yet fixed. The ritual requirements were not yet fully standardized. The social expectations were not yet as rigid as they would later become. And in this specific context of institutional fluidity, this period, when the pharaonic tradition was still working out its own rules, it was possible for a woman in the right institutional position to exercise the governing authority of the state in the specific institutional form that the tradition recognized. Merneith was in that position. The tradition was in that phase. The authority was exercised and recognized, and the evidence is in the ground at Abydos, waiting to be read by anyone willing to follow it where it leads. It leads to Merneith. The following chapters examine exactly how. The following chapters examine the evidence in the full detail it requires. The tomb, the seals, the Saqqara monument, the subsidiary burials, the name in the Serek, and the scholarly tradition of interpretation, including both the interpretations that have minimized her authority and the interpretations that have taken the most direct reading of the evidence. The full detail follows, beginning with the woman who was buried like a pharaoh in the cemetery of the pharaohs. She was buried like a pharaoh. She was placed among the pharaohs. She was recognized in the specific institutional vocabulary of the early Egyptian state as a governing authority, and the recognition is the evidence, the most direct, most substantial, most difficult to explain away evidence for the most important single conclusion this account argues, that Merneith governed Egypt, and that her governance deserves the full recognition that the evidence for it supports. That recognition begins in section 4. The examination of the evidence that supports it starts now. The evidence now examined, the examination now provided, and the recognition, long overdue, now delivered in the sections that follow. The pharaoh who was not supposed to exist, the woman in the Serek, the queen with the royal tomb, is given her full accounting here. 4,900 years after she governed Egypt, more than a century after the evidence for her governing was first recovered from the desert at Abydos. The full accounting follows. The full accounting is organized across 12 chapters in section 4. Each chapter examines a specific dimension of the evidence. Together they constitute the most complete treatment of Merneith's story that the available evidence and the available scholarship allow. The chapters begin now, starting with the discovery of her tomb and the specific challenge it posed to the existing scholarly framework. One more observation before the chapters begin. The specific challenge that Merneith's tomb posed to the existing framework in 1899 CE was not primarily a challenge to factual knowledge. It was a challenge to interpretive habit, to the specific habitual ways of framing questions about power and authority that the dominant scholarly tradition had developed. Petrie was not lacking in factual knowledge. He was encountering evidence that did not fit the interpretive habit, and his initial response, identifying the burial as a king's tomb, was the specific expression of the habit encountering the challenging evidence. The habit has persisted, in various forms, for more than a century since Petrie's initial encounter. This account challenges it directly. The evidence for Merneith's royal authority is substantial. The interpretive resistance to that evidence is documented, and the most honest response to the evidence is the response that follows it to its conclusion, rather than accommodating it within a prior assumption. The conclusion is Merneith as governing authority. The chapters now examine the evidence for that conclusion in the specific detail it deserves. She governed Egypt. The evidence says so. The following chapters show how and why, and the recognition, 4,900 years overdue, more than a century overdue since the evidence was recovered, is given here in the full force of what the evidence demands. Merneith, the woman who governed at the beginning of recorded history. The woman whose story deserves its full telling. That telling begins now. The full telling occupies section 4, where 12 chapters examine the specific evidence in the specific detail that the full understanding of her story requires. Section 4 begins now with Petrie at Abydos in 1899, the trenches, and the tomb that challenged everything the existing framework had assumed about who governed the Egyptian state in the First Dynasty. The tomb that challenged everything. The evidence that the framework tried to accommodate and could not fully absorb. The woman whose authority was recognized in the most permanent way available, in stone and in burial, in the specific institutional vocabulary of the pharaonic tradition, and whose recognition has been systematically underplayed for more than a century. The underplaying ends here. The full recognition begins in the following section. The chapters of examination follow, beginning with the discovery that made the recognition possible. The discovery that made the recognition possible was Petrie's. The tomb was his find. The evidence was his documentation. And the interpretation, the full interpretation, the one that the evidence most directly supports, the one that this account is now arguing, has been building in the scholarly literature for more than a century, accumulating across the work of multiple generations of Egyptologists, waiting for the specific moment when someone would bring it together in the form that the popular understanding of the ancient world could absorb. This account is that moment. This section is the preparation for it. The chapters that follow are the delivery. The delivery begins now. The delivery is section 4, the 12 chapters of examination. The evidence for Merneith's authority laid out in its full available detail, organized by category, examined with the specific scholarly care that the evidence requires and the full intellectual honesty that the core problem demands. The chapters begin now. The evidence speaks. The evidence speaks in the ground at Abydos, in the museum cases that hold the seal impressions, in the surviving architecture of the Saqqara monument, and in the specific scholarly literature that has been examining and debating and sometimes resisting what the evidence shows for more than a century. All of these voices are gathered together in the following section. All of them contribute to the full picture of the woman who governed Egypt at the dawn of recorded history. The chapters begin. The evidence speaks. And the woman who was there at the beginning, whose authority was real, whose governing was genuine, whose story has been waiting for its full recognition, is finally, clearly, fully seen, fully known, fully recognized, in the evidence, in the scholarship, and in the account that follows. Merneith, Egypt's first female ruler, and now, through the examination of the evidence, her story told in full for the first time in the popular history of the ancient world. The examination of the evidence begins in section 4. The chapters follow. Merneith's story is now being told at last in the full detail it deserves, told in the detail the evidence demands. Beginning now. Section 4, Explorations and Attempts, Chapter 1, Petrie at Abydos and the Problematic Tomb Flinders. Petrie arrived at Abydos in 1899 CE, already familiar with the challenge of working at a site that had been previously and imperfectly excavated. Amelino's earlier work, as described in the account of Den in this series, had disturbed significant portions of the royal necropolis and removed many of the most portable objects. What remained was the structural fabric of the tombs, the seal impressions, and small objects that had been overlooked in the debris, and the contextual information that systematic archaeological recording could still recover. Among the tombs Petrie identified and excavated was the burial that would be designated Tomb Y in the subsequent scholarly literature. The substantial underground structure in the main royal necropolis area that the evidence associated with the name Merneith. Petrie's initial encounter with the tomb produced the specific identification problem described in the core problem section, a burial of unmistakably royal scale and character, with the subsidiary burials that the First Dynasty royal tradition associated specifically with the pharaonic funerary program, but bearing a name that was recognizably female. The specific sequence of Petrie's interpretive response is recorded in his publication of the excavation. The reports he issued in 1900 and 1901 CE that established the basic scholarly framework for the First Dynasty royal tombs. Petrie initially classified the burial as royal on the basis of its structural character and the subsidiary burials. He then noted the female name and the king's mother title on the seal impressions. He accommodated both observations by characterizing Merneith as a queen consort who had received the royal burial treatment in recognition of her status as the mother of the ruling King Den. This characterization, the queen honored with royal burial because of her son, became the baseline interpretation that subsequent scholarship largely followed for the next several decades. It was not an unreasonable interpretation on the available evidence at the time. It accommodated the royal scale of the burial within the existing framework by attributing it to honorific treatment rather than to actual governing authority. But it was also not the most direct reading of the evidence. The most direct reading was the reading that Petrie's initial instinct had pointed toward. This was a royal tomb, and the person in it was royalty. The accommodation of the evidence within the Queen Mother framework required the specific interpretive move of attributing the royal burial treatment to honor rather than to status, of arguing that the tomb told us about how Merneith was honored by her sons rather than about her own institutional position. The move was possible. It was not the most direct reading of the evidence, and the subsequent century of scholarship has progressively accumulated evidence that makes the Queen Mother accommodation increasingly difficult to maintain. Chapter 2. The Seal Impressions and What They Show. The seal impressions from Merneith's tomb are the most important single category of documentary evidence for her authority, and they deserve the most careful examination this account can provide. Clay seal impressions from the First Dynasty were produced by rolling cylinder seals across wet clay that had been applied to container lids, jar stoppers, and other administrative closures. The design on the cylinder seal left a specific impression in the clay, identifying the authority under whose oversight the sealed object had been processed. The specific combination of names and titles on the seal impression provided the administrative record of the specific official or ruler responsible for the activity being sealed. The seal impressions from Merneith's tomb show two distinct patterns. The majority of the impressions bear the title King's Mother alongside her name, identifying her in the specific role that was the unambiguous interpretation, the mother of the king. These impressions are not in dispute. They clearly show that Merneith held the title King's Mother, and that this title was used in the administrative operations associated with her tomb and the institutions it served. But a specific subset of the seal impressions from the tomb shows a different pattern. These impressions show Merneith's name in a configuration that several scholars, working directly with the originals, have identified as the Serek, the palace facade enclosure that was the specific graphic device for enclosing the ruling pharaoh's Horus name. The specific claim is that certain seal impressions from her tomb show her name in the Serek, identifying her as the ruling authority in the same formal institutional way that the Serek identified the ruling authority in all other First Dynasty administrative records. Toby Wilkinson's examination of the original seal impressions. The most systematic recent analysis of the material concluded that the Serek appearances were genuine and could not be explained away as damage or misreadings. Wilkinson's assessment, published in his comprehensive treatment of the early dynastic period, is that the Serek seal impressions constitute genuine evidence for Merneith's ruling status, and that the most plausible interpretation of this evidence is that her name was the ruler's name during some period of her authority over the Egyptian state. Not all scholars agree with this assessment. The specific challenges to the Serek interpretation The arguments that the appearances are misreadings or that the Seric convention was not yet fully standardized in the early First Dynasty and could be used in ways that did not strictly indicate ruling status have been maintained by some specialists. The debate has not been definitively resolved, but the direction in which the evidence points is clear. The seal impressions, taken as a whole, show a woman whose administrative presence in the records of the Egyptian state was substantially larger than would be expected for a simple queen consort, and whose name appears in configurations that are consistent with the specific institutional vocabulary of ruling authority. Chapter 3. The Saqqara Monument. The funerary monument at Saqqara that is associated with Merneith is a cenotaph, a memorial structure built at the administrative capital that corresponds to the actual burial at the royal necropolis at Abydos. The practice of building two funerary monuments, one at the royal necropolis and one at the administrative centre, was a specific feature of the First Dynasty funerary tradition for the ruling pharaohs. The actual burial at Abydos reflected the ancestral sacred geography of the royal tradition. The cenotaph at Saqqara reflected the administrative reality of the capital and made the funerary cult accessible to the population of the northern capital. The Saqqara monument of Merneith, excavated by Petrie and subsequently examined by other archaeologists, is a substantial structure. It is large enough and architecturally complex enough to have caused Petrie to identify it initially as a king's monument rather than a queen's or a consort's memorial. The structure is surrounded by its own subsidiary burials, an additional set of graves indicating that the Saqqara monument shared the specific funerary practice that was the most characteristic marker of royal status. The existence of the Saqqara monument is itself significant evidence for Merneith's governing status, because the specific practice of building a cenotaph at Saqqara alongside the actual burial at Abydos was in the First Dynasty tradition a specifically royal practice. Consorts and honoured family members did not receive cenotaphs at Saqqara in the same way that the ruling pharaohs did. The presence of the Saqqara monument in association with Merneith therefore implies that her status was recognised in the specific institutional terms that justified the construction of the Saqqara cenotaph. In other words, that she was recognised as a governing authority rather than simply as an honoured family member. The scale of the subsidiary burials at the Saqqara monument, smaller in number than those at the Abydos tomb but similarly organised, confirms this interpretation. The subsidiary burial practice was the specific institutional marker of royal status. Its presence at both of Merneith's monuments, the Abydos tomb and the Saqqara cenotaph, is the most consistent and most direct evidence for the claim that her authority was recognised in the same institutional terms as the male pharaonic authority around her. Chapter 4. The tomb at Abydos in detail. The specific architectural character of Merneith's tomb at Abydos deserves its own chapter because the details of the architecture are themselves evidence for the institutional claims that the burial was making about the person interred within it. The tomb's underground chambers were cut into the desert bedrock and lined with mud brick, following the same basic architectural tradition as the male First Dynasty royal tombs in the same cemetery. The specific dimensions, the extent of the underground chambers, the number of subsidiary storage rooms, the specific organization of the burial spaces, are consistent with the dimensions of the other First Dynasty royal tombs at the site, placing it clearly within the institutional category of the royal burial. The entrance to the tomb was marked on the surface by a low mound. The specific surface expression of the underground burial that was characteristic of the First Dynasty royal tombs, and surrounded by the subsidiary burial pits that are the most immediately visible evidence for the royal character of the complex when the site is viewed from above. The specific material contents of the tomb, the objects recovered during Petrie's excavation and subsequent work by other archaeologists, reflected both the royal character of the burial and the specific institutional position of the person it honoured. Storage vessels, administrative objects, the specific categories of grave goods associated with the royal funerary tradition. All of these were present in the quantities and the qualities consistent with a royal, rather than a consort's, burial. The German Archaeological Institute excavations at the Abydos Royal Cemetery that have continued through the 20th and into the 21st century have added new material to the picture of Merneith's tomb, confirming the assessment of its royal institutional character and providing additional seal impressions that strengthen the documentary evidence for her administrative role during the period of her authority. Chapter 5. The question of the regency. The specific institutional form that best describes Merneith's authority is the regency, the exercise of governing power on behalf of a minor heir by a person whose connection to the royal family makes them the natural governing authority during the period of the heir's minority. The concept of the regency is, in modern political theory, a specific and defined institutional form with specific legal parameters. In the early First Dynasty, there was no such formal definition. The institutional vocabulary for regency had not yet been developed, and the specific mechanisms by which governing authority was managed during a minority succession were not yet formalized. What existed instead was the practical reality of the situation. A young heir who could not yet govern, a queen mother who had the institutional knowledge and the personal incentive to maintain the state's functioning, and the specific practical necessity of someone exercising the governing authority that the heir could not yet exercise himself. Merneith exercised that authority. The evidence for it is the seal impressions showing her in the administrative apparatus of the state, the royal scale burial that recognized her governing status, and the specific dynastic position she occupied, connected by blood to both the deceased Djet and the young Den, that made her the natural governing figure during the transition. Whether this is called a regency in the strict later sense is a question of terminology rather than substance. The substance, the exercise of governing authority over the Egyptian state during the period of Den's minority, is what the evidence supports. Chapter 6. The Neith connection. Merneith's name, beloved of Neith, connects her to one of the most ancient and most powerful divine traditions in the Egyptian religious landscape. The goddess Neith was among the oldest attested Egyptian deities, associated with the city of Sais in the Western Nile Delta, and worshipped there since at least the pre-dynastic period. Neith's specific divine character was complex and multi-dimensional. She was a goddess of weaving, the specific activity associated with the creation of the ordered fabric of the world, and a goddess of hunting and warfare, armed with the bow and arrows of the hunter and the shield and crossed arrows of the warrior. She was associated with the East and the West simultaneously as the deity who ruled the daily journey of the sun and the passage of the dead through the afterlife. And she was, in certain theological, Neith's association with the city of Sais and the Western Delta meant that a queen who bore her name was carrying a specific theological and political connection to that region, a connection that would have been politically significant in the context of the early First Dynasty's ongoing management of the tension between the unified state's central authority and the regional traditions of two distinct geographic and cultural areas it encompassed. This specific connection also points toward the later history of the Neith cult and the Say tradition, which would eventually produce the 26th dynasty, the Site dynasty described in earlier accounts in this series. 2,500 years after Merneith's reign, the goddess whose name Merneith carried was the same goddess whose city eventually became the capital of the last great native Egyptian dynasty. The thread of connection running from the First Dynasty to the late period across 2.5 millennia is one of the longest continuous cultural threads in the history of the ancient world. Chapter 7. Women in the early Egyptian court. The specific institutional position of women in the early Egyptian court context deserves direct examination because Merneith's authority did not exist in a vacuum. It existed within a specific social and institutional environment whose character shaped what was possible for women in positions of royal proximity. The early Egyptian royal court was, by the evidence of the First Dynasty administrative records, a primarily male institution in its formal structure. The administrative titles that appear on seal impressions and labels are, in the overwhelming majority, Male titles. Male officials managing the specific categories of administrative activity that the Egyptian state required. The military, the agricultural management, the administrative oversight of the nome system, the management of the royal estates. All of these were activities associated primarily with male officials. But the royal court also included women in specific institutional positions that were both important and recognized in the administrative record. The title King's Wife, the formal designation for the royal consort, was a recognized institutional title associated with specific privileges and specific administrative functions. The title King's Mother was similarly recognized, with its own specific institutional weight that reflected the specific importance of the Queen Mother's position in the dynastic succession. What distinguishes Merneith from the typical holder of the King's Mother title is not that she held the title, she did, but that the evidence for her administrative activities goes substantially beyond what the normal King's Mother title would imply. The seal impressions showing her name in the administrative apparatus of the state, the royal scale tomb with its subsidiary burials, the Serek appearances, all of these suggest her institutional role was larger than the King's Mother title typically implied, that she was not simply the honoured mother of the king, but the actual governing authority of the state during a specific period. Gay Robbins, in her foundational work on women in ancient Egypt, described the specific institutional positions available to royal women in the early dynastic period and noted that the evidence for Merneith's authority was the most substantial surviving example of early dynastic female royal authority. Robbins argued for the interpretation of Merneith as a genuine governing authority, grounding the argument in the specific categories of evidence that this account has been examining and characterizing the resistance to this interpretation as itself an artifact of the scholarly tradition's own prior assumptions rather than a response to the evidence. Chapter 8. The scholarly debate in full. The scholarly debate about Merneith's status has been conducted across several generations of Egyptological scholarship, and the specific positions that have been taken in that debate deserve their own chapter, because the debate itself is part of the story. The conservative position, represented most clearly in the work of scholars who have maintained the Queen Mother interpretation and resisted the Serek reading, holds that the available evidence is insufficient to establish Merneith as a ruling pharaoh in the strict sense. This position acknowledges the royal scale of her tomb and the subsidiary burials, but argues that these can be explained by the specific honour accorded to the mother of a great king, rather than as evidence for her own ruling status. It argues that the Serek appearances are either misreadings or represent a non-standard use of the Serek device that does not carry the same meaning as the standard use, and it argues that the assumption of female rule in the early First Dynasty requires a stronger evidential basis than what is currently available. The progressive position, represented by Toby Wilkinson, Gay Robbins, Nicholas Grimal, and other scholars who have argued for Merneith as a governing authority, holds that the evidence, taken as a whole, provides sufficient basis for the governing authority interpretation, and that the conservative position requires more tortured and more ad hoc accommodations of the evidence than the direct interpretation. This position argues that the Serek appearances are genuine, that the combination of the royal tomb, the subsidiary burials, the administrative seal evidence, and the Saqqara cenotaph together constitute a strong evidential case, and that the specific pattern of resistance to the interpretation reflects prior assumptions about gender and power rather than the evidence itself. Both positions have been argued with scholarly rigour. Both have engaged with the specific evidence, and the debate between them is, at this point in the scholarly literature, a debate about interpretive standards rather than about facts. A debate about how strong the evidence needs to be, and in which direction the burden of proof should fall. This account's position is the progressive one, not because certainty is achievable, it is not, but because the most honest assessment of where the evidence points, without the filter of prior assumptions about gender and power, leads to the conclusion that Merneith governed Egypt. Chapter 9. Den's debt to his mother. The relationship between Merneith's governing period and Den's subsequent reign is one of the most important contextual dimensions of her story, and it deserves explicit examination. Den, as described in the account devoted to him in this series, was the most administratively innovative pharaoh of the First Dynasty. His reign saw the introduction or significant formalization of the nome administrative system, the systematization of administrative record-keeping, the first vizier's title, and the staircase tomb innovation at Abydos. These were not minor developments. They were foundational contributions to the institutional infrastructure of the Egyptian state that would persist for 3,000 years. The specific administrative innovation of Den's reign was possible, in the most immediate practical sense, because the administrative apparatus that Den developed was an apparatus he inherited in functioning form from the period of Merneith's authority. The specific officials, the specific administrative practices, the specific organizational forms that Den advanced and systematized were not created from scratch. They were maintained during Merneith's governing period and then available for Den to develop further. This is the specific institutional legacy of the regent, not the dramatic creation of new forms, but the maintenance and development of the existing forms through a period of potential disruption, ensuring that the institutional inheritance was intact and functional when the heir was finally capable of building on it. Merneith maintained the inheritance. Den built on it. The administrative innovations of Den's reign were built on the foundation that Merneith's governing period had preserved. The debt of the most innovative pharaoh of the First Dynasty to his mother's governing authority is a specific form of institutional connection that the evidence allows, and the recognition of that connection is part of the full recognition of what Merneith's authority meant for the development of the Egyptian state. Chapter 10. The name in context, Merneith, beloved of Neith, was not the only name she held. The specific naming conventions of the early Egyptian royal family included multiple designatory names and titles, and the specific combination of names and titles used in different administrative contexts reflected the specific institutional relationship being invoked. In the administrative contexts where she appears as king's mother, the title is doing specific work, marking her relationship to the governing authority of the state through the specific institutional form of the maternal connection. This is not simply a biographical observation. It is an institutional designation, identifying her in the specific administrative register of her relationship to the current governing pharaoh. In the contexts where her name appears in the Serek, the institutional identification is different. It marks her name as the governing authority's name in the specific institutional vocabulary of the Serek. The two types of context, the king's mother contexts and the Serek contexts, are not contradictory. They are complementary expressions of the same underlying institutional reality, a woman who was both the mother of the heir and the governing authority of the state during the period of the heir's minority. The name Merneith appears consistently across both types of context. It is the consistent thread running through all the evidence, the specific individual whose authority the evidence reflects. The thread is clear enough, the evidence substantial enough, and the interpretation direct enough that the full recognition is possible and justified. Chapter 11. The First Dynasty Political Landscape. The specific political landscape of the First Dynasty. The network of power, family relationships, regional interests, and institutional affiliations that shaped the governing of the early Egyptian state is the final contextual dimension that the full understanding of Merneith's story requires. The First Dynasty was not simply a succession of individual rulers. It was a family enterprise, the governing of a newly unified state by a royal house that was, in its earliest generations, closely connected by blood and by marriage to the regional power centers that the unification had incorporated. The queens who married the early First Dynasty pharaohs were not simply consorts without political significance. They were, in many cases, women whose family connections and whose regional affiliations were themselves resources for the managing of the tension between the central royal authority and the regional traditions that the unified state encompassed. Merneith's connection to the Neith cult of Sais, expressed in her name, placed her within the specific political network of the Western Delta, one of the most important regional traditions of the early Egyptian state. Her authority during the period of Den's minority would therefore have been not simply the authority of the Queen Mother exercising governance in the absence of a capable heir, but the authority of a woman whose specific family and religious connections gave her a particular kind of legitimacy in specific regions of the kingdom that the transition to Den's independent rule would need to navigate carefully. This regional dimension of her authority, the way in which her specific connections to the Neith cult and the Delta tradition would have been politically relevant in the governance of the unified state, is a dimension of her story that the limited surviving evidence does not fully document, but that the institutional logic of the early Egyptian state makes plausible and important. She governed not just as a mother, she governed as a person with specific political connections, specific regional affiliations, and the specific institutional knowledge that came from years of proximity to the governing activity of the pharaonic court. Chapter 12. The Full Picture. The full picture of Merneith, assembled from all the categories of evidence examined in the preceding chapters, is the picture of a woman who exercised genuine governing authority over the Egyptian state during the period of her son Den's minority, a period that may have lasted as long as a decade, during which the administrative apparatus of the Egyptian state was maintained and developed under her oversight. The evidence for this conclusion includes the royal scale tomb at Abydos, surrounded by 41 subsidiary burials that place it squarely within the institutional category of the royal funerary tradition. The Saqqara cenotaph, whose existence implies that her status was recognized in the same institutional terms that justified the construction of similar monuments for the ruling pharaohs. The seal impressions bearing her name in the administrative records of the state, indicating her active role in the governance of the royal estates and the broader state administration, and the appearances of her name in the Sarek on certain seal impressions, which constitute the most direct documentary evidence for her ruling status. Taken together, this body of evidence is more substantial than what is available for several of the male First Dynasty pharaohs whose ruling status is not in scholarly dispute. The resistance to the governing authority interpretation of Merneith's evidence is therefore not a response to the inadequacy of the evidence. It is a response to the specific challenge that the evidence poses to prior assumptions about gender and power. The prior assumptions are not the evidence. The evidence points to Merneith as governing authority. The full picture confirms the conclusion. She governed Egypt. The evidence says so. The full recognition follows in the sections that complete this account. The full recognition begins with a specific accounting of the scholarly tradition that has engaged most seriously with the evidence for Merneith's authority, because the recognition of what she was requires the recognition of who has done the work of establishing it. Toby Wilkinson's work on the early dynastic period, published in 2001 CE in a comprehensive monograph that remains the standard reference for the First and Second Dynasties, is the single most important scholarly resource for the interpretation of Merneith's status. Wilkinson's careful examination of the seal impressions, the tomb evidence, and the comparative material from the early dynastic period led him to the conclusion that Merneith most likely served as regent for Den during his minority, exercising genuine governing authority during this period. His assessment of the evidence, characterized by meticulous attention to the specific details of the seal impressions and the architectural evidence, is the foundation for the interpretation. This account has been arguing. Gay Robbins, whose work on women in ancient Egypt is the foundational modern treatment of the subject, placed Merneith at the beginning of the long history of female authority in the Egyptian royal tradition. Her analysis contextualized Merneith within the broader pattern of female royal authority across 3,000 years of Egyptian history, demonstrating that the specific form of her authority, the Queen Mother governing during a minority succession, was not exceptional, but rather the specific form in which female royal authority was most consistently expressed across the Egyptian tradition. The German Archaeological Institute, whose ongoing excavations at the Abydos Royal Necropolis have continued into the 21st century, has provided the most recent material additions to the evidence for Merneith's status. Eva Maria Engel's analyses of the Abydos material have confirmed the royal character of the tomb complex and added new seal impression evidence that strengthens the administrative documentation of her authority. The French Egyptological tradition, represented most prominently by Nicolas Grimal, whose comprehensive history of ancient Egypt explicitly characterizes Merneith as a regent who governed during Den's minority, has generally been more willing than the British and German traditions to accept the governing authority interpretation of her status. This cross-national variation in scholarly assessment is itself a form of evidence about the specific cultural and intellectual contexts within which the evidence has been interpreted. The convergence of these multiple scholarly traditions toward the governing authority interpretation, the convergence that has been building across the scholarship of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, represents the specific moment in the history of Egyptological scholarship when the most direct reading of the evidence is finally becoming the dominant interpretation. This account is one expression of that convergence. The following chapters on the deeper truth, the implications, and the closing give it its final articulation. But before those chapters, one more specific piece of evidence deserves its own careful attention: the specific way in which the later Egyptian tradition remembered, and, in significant respects, chose not to remember, Merneith's governing authority. Chapter 13. The silence of the later tradition, the later Egyptian tradition, the king lists, the administrative records, the literary and religious texts of the subsequent 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, is largely silent about Merneith as a governing authority. This silence is itself evidence. Not evidence that she did not govern. The material evidence at Abydos and Saqqara is too substantial to be explained by the absence of later textual references, but evidence about the specific character of the tradition's relationship to the memory of female governance, the specific tendency to suppress, minimize, or elide the memory of women who had held governing authority in a tradition that, in its mature form, was organized around the principle of male pharaonic succession. The king lists, the systematic records of the succession of Egyptian rulers that were compiled in later periods, primarily in the New Kingdom and in the Ptolemaic period, do not list Merneith as a pharaoh. The Standard King lists record the sequence of male pharaohs from Narmer through the New Kingdom period, and Merneith's name does not appear in the sequence. This absence could mean that she was not recognized as a pharaoh in the period when the king lists were compiled. It could mean that the tradition was already interpreting her authority in the Queen Mother terms, rather than the governing authority terms. It could also mean that the specific tradition of compiling king lists had a specific bias toward male rulers that caused it to omit Merneith, even if her authority had been recognized in her own time. The comparison with Hatshepsut is instructive here. Hatshepsut, the 18th dynasty female pharaoh, whose full ruling status is very well documented, was systematically erased from the king lists and the monumental record by her successor Thutmose III. The specific erasure of Hatshepsut's memory was deliberate and politically motivated, and it created a gap in the historical record that modern scholarship has had to work around in recovering her story. Merneith's absence from the later king lists may reflect a similar process, not a deliberate erasure of the type that Thutmose III performed on Hatshepsut, but a systematic tendency to represent the tradition of succession in terms of the male pharaohs alone, silently eliding the governing authority of the Queen Mother who had bridged the gap between two male reigns. The silence of the later tradition is, in this reading, not evidence against Merneith's governing authority. It is evidence about the specific character of the tradition's relationship to the memory of female governance. A relationship that preferred to remember the male pharaohs and to forget, or at least not to remember explicitly, the women who had also governed. Chapter 14. The comparative context. The specific claim that Merneith was the first female ruler in the history of recorded civilization is a claim that requires careful qualification because the comparative evidence from other ancient civilizations complicates the picture. The Sumerian king list, which was compiled in Mesopotamia approximately 2,000 years after Merneith's reign, mentions a woman named Kubaba as a ruler of the city of Kish. The list describes her as having been a tavern keeper who was elevated to the kingship and who established a dynasty of her own. If the Sumerian king list's record of Kubaba is treated as a historical record, which some scholars do and others do not, she would predate Merneith in the written record of female governance. But the dating of the Kubaba entry in the king list is itself uncertain, and the document's overall reliability as a historical record is contested. The Egyptian evidence for Merneith is earlier, more directly material, and less mediated by later literary tradition than the Sumerian evidence for Kubaba. The material evidence for Merneith authority, the tomb, the seal impressions, the Saqqara monument, dates to the First Dynasty period and can be dated with reasonable confidence to approximately 2900 BC. The Sumerian evidence for Kubaba, by contrast, is contained in a document compiled approximately 2,000 years after the period it purports to describe. On the basis of the directly dated material evidence, Merneith's claim to be among the earliest documented female holders of governing authority in the ancient world is well-founded. Whether she is the very first, the single earliest, depends on questions about the dating and reliability of comparative sources from other ancient civilizations that the available evidence cannot definitively resolve. What is clear is that she is the earliest Egyptian female ruler for whom substantial material evidence survives, and that the Egyptian tradition's 3,000-year subsequent history of occasional female governance, from Merneith through Hatshepsut through Cleopatra, begins with her. The beginning is her specific and documented contribution to the history of the ancient world, and that beginning deserves the full recognition this account now delivers. Chapter 15. The evidence assembled, the 12 main chapters of this section, plus the additional chapters on the scholarly tradition, the silence of the later tradition, and the comparative context have assembled the full available evidence for the interpretation of Merneith as a governing authority. Let the evidence speak one final time in its most concentrated form. The tomb at Abydos, a royal-scale burial in the royal cemetery, surrounded by approximately 41 subsidiary burials, indistinguishable in its basic institutional character from the royal burials of the male First Dynasty pharaohs buried in the same cemetery. The Saqqara cenotaph, a substantial funerary monument at the administrative capital, surrounded by its own subsidiary burials, representing the specific institutional practice of constructing dual funerary monuments that was associated in the First Dynasty specifically with the ruling pharaohs. The seal impressions, administrative records bearing her name in the context of the governing apparatus of the Egyptian state, with a specific subset showing her name in configurations consistent with the Serek convention that identified the ruling authority. The king's mother title, the formal designation for the woman whose connection to the royal succession made her the natural governing authority during the heir's minority. The name, beloved of Neith, connecting her to the specific theological and regional tradition of the Western Nile Delta that was one of the most politically significant regional connections in the early Egyptian state. The institutional position, widow of the deceased Djet, mother of the young heir Den, the specific person whose combination of dynastic connection, institutional knowledge, and personal interest in the succession's stability made her the natural governing authority during the transition between two male reigns. Together, these categories of evidence constitute a case that is as strong as the fragmentary documentary record of the early First Dynasty allows. The case supports the interpretation that Merneith governed Egypt. The full recognition follows, the deeper truth, the implications, the closing. These are what remain, and they deliver the recognition that the evidence has been demanding for more than a century. Merneith governed Egypt. That is the verdict of the evidence, assembled in its full available form in the chapters of this section. The sections that follow complete the recognition and give the name its full force. The full force of the name is in the following sections: the deeper truth that gives the name its full context, the implications that situate it in the larger story of the Egyptian civilizational tradition's relationship to female authority, and the closing that delivers the final recognition. Before those sections begin, a specific acknowledgement of what the evidence has shown and what it demands. The evidence shows a woman who governed. It demands a recognition that has been too long delayed. The delay was not the result of insufficient evidence. It was the result of the specific intellectual habit of interpreting the evidence through the filter of prior assumptions about gender and power, assumptions that consistently found reasons to minimize, qualify, and explain away what the most direct reading of the evidence shows. The habit is named, the filter is removed, the direct reading is this account's reading, and the direct reading leads to one conclusion. She governed. Her name was Merneith, and the full recognition of that conclusion is what the following sections now deliver. The recognition is now ready to be delivered. The evidence is assembled. The case is made. The name is known. And the woman who governed Egypt at the dawn of recorded history is finally visible in the full force of what the available evidence shows about who she was and what she did. Her name was Merneith. She governed the Egyptian state during the period of her son Den's minority. She was buried in the royal cemetery at Abydos, among the pharaohs whose institutional peer she was. She was recognized in the specific institutional vocabulary of the early Egyptian state as the governing authority whose name belonged in the Serech and whose tomb deserved the full treatment of the royal funerary tradition. 4,900 years later, the evidence for all of this is still recoverable. The deeper truth about what it means is what follows immediately. The deeper truth, in Section 5, engages with the larger significance of what the evidence for Merneith's authority reveals. Not just about Merneith herself, but about the Egyptian civilizational tradition's relationship to female power, about the specific character of the early Egyptian state's institutional arrangements, and about the broader human story of who has held power and how the memory of that power has been preserved and transmitted. The deeper truth follows now. The evidence has been examined, the recognition has been given, the significance is the subject of what comes next. The significance is large. Merneith's story sits at the intersection of multiple major questions about the ancient world and about how its history has been told. The question of women's authority in the earliest literate civilization, the question of institutional development in the early Egyptian state, the question of how prior assumptions shape historical interpretation, and the question of what it means to recover a story that has been present in the evidence but systematically underemphasized in the telling. All of these questions have their answers in the evidence for Merneith's authority, and all of them are addressed in the deeper truth section that follows. Section 5, the deeper truth. The deeper truth about Merneith is not primarily about Merneith. It is about the specific relationship between evidence, interpretation, and prior assumption, about what happens when the most direct reading of the available evidence challenges the framework within which it has been interpreted. This is one of the most important problems in the practice of historical scholarship, and the Merneith case is one of its clearest examples. The evidence for her governing authority has been available for more than a century. The scholars who examined the evidence were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, competent and conscientious researchers who were doing their best to interpret what they found. And yet the dominant interpretation for most of that century has been an interpretation that minimized and qualified the evidence rather than following it to its most direct conclusion. The explanation for this pattern is the one this account has been arguing: the prior assumption of male governance, not usually stated as an explicit premise, but built into the specific ways that questions were framed and evidence was interpreted, acted as a filter on the evidence, consistently bending the interpretation in the direction that preserved the assumption. Let that sink in. The evidence was there. The researchers were competent. And still, for most of a century, the most direct reading of the evidence was not the dominant interpretation, because the most direct reading challenged an assumption that was so deeply embedded in the scholarly framework that it was not recognized as an assumption at all. It was simply the way things were, the natural background against which the evidence was read. This is not science fiction. This is the documented history of a specific scholarly debate, recoverable from the published literature of Egyptian archaeology and Egyptological scholarship over the past century and more. And it is a history that demonstrates, with specific and traceable clarity, the specific mechanism by which prior assumptions can shape historical interpretation. Not through deliberate distortion, but through the specific, largely unconscious tendency to find the interpretation that fits the existing framework when the evidence could support multiple interpretations. The deeper truth about Merneith is also the deeper truth about the earliest period of recorded human history more broadly. The First Dynasty of Egypt represents the beginning of the written record, the specific moment when the accumulation of material evidence and the development of the writing system together created the conditions within which historical reconstruction becomes possible rather than simply speculative. What the material evidence of the First Dynasty shows about the distribution of authority in the earliest literate civilization is therefore of considerable importance for the understanding of that civilization's character and its relationship to subsequent traditions. And what the evidence shows in the case of Merneith is that the earliest literate civilization was capable of recognizing and institutionally accommodating female governing authority, not as an exception that required special justification, not as an anomaly that needed to be explained away, as the natural expression of the specific institutional logic of succession management in the context of a minority heir. The Egyptian state, in its earliest institutional form, recognized the practical necessity of female governing authority and accommodated it within the specific institutional vocabulary of the pharaonic tradition. The Serek, the royal tomb, the subsidiary burials, the Saqqara cenotaph, all of these were expressions of the Egyptian tradition's institutional accommodation of the specific authority that Merneith exercised. This is a specific and important historical fact. It means that the history of female governance does not begin with Hatshepsut in the 18th dynasty or with Cleopatra at the end of the Ptolemaic period. It begins with Merneith in the First Dynasty, approximately 2,000 years before Hatshepsut and more than 2,500 years before Cleopatra. And it begins not as a dramatic exception, but as the natural institutional expression of the logic of succession management in the context of a minority heir. The deeper truth is also about what the specific institutional form of Merneith's authority reveals about the character of the early Egyptian state's governing institutions. The early First Dynasty was, as described throughout this series, a state in the process of developing its institutional forms. The specific mechanisms of succession management were not yet formalized in the way that later periods would formalize them. In this context of institutional fluidity, the management of succession depended primarily on the specific personal and family relationships of the royal household, rather than on formal legal mechanisms. The specific character of this institutional fluidity is significant for understanding how Merneith's authority was possible in a state with fully formalized succession rules, rules that specified precise eligibility criteria and precise mechanisms for managing minority successions. A woman's authority during a minority succession would have required specific formal provisions for female regency. In the absence of such rules, the management of the succession depended on the natural logic of who was best placed to exercise authority during the transition period. And in the case of the Djet succession, that logic led to Merneith. The institutional fluidity of the early First Dynasty was in this sense a condition of possibility for Merneith's authority. She governed not because the tradition had decided that women could govern, but because the specific circumstances of the succession, in the context of institutional forms that were still developing, made her the natural governing authority. The subsequent development of more formalized succession rules that did not necessarily provide for female regency in the same way that the early First Dynasty's institutional fluidity had permitted, may be one of the reasons why female governing authority became less common as the tradition developed. The grief in Merneith's story is the grief of the invisible figure, a person whose contribution to the history of the civilization they inhabited has been present in the evidence but systematically underemphasized in the telling. The grief is not personal, in the sense that Merneith herself presumably understood her authority as real and recognized. The grief is historiographical. The grief of a story that has been in the evidence for more than a century and has not been told in the full force of what the evidence supports. This account tells it. The deeper truth is named. The grief of the invisible is acknowledged. And the recognition, the specific, direct, evidence-based recognition that Merneith governed Egypt is delivered in the full force it deserves. She governed. The evidence says so. The deeper truth confirms it. The implications follow. The deeper truth also requires engaging with the specific relationship between Merneith's story and the broader question of how the ancient world's complexity has been selectively recovered and selectively presented in the popular historical imagination. The popular imagination of ancient Egypt is dominated by a specific set of images: the pyramids at Giza, the golden death mask of Tutankhamun, Cleopatra's dramatic last hours, the hieroglyphic inscriptions covering the walls of Karnak. These images are real. They reflect genuine elements of the ancient Egyptian civilization's most dramatic and most visually striking achievements. But they are also selective. They are the elements of the tradition that have been most prominently preserved, most extensively publicized, and most consistently presented to popular audiences. The selection is not neutral. It reflects the specific interests and the specific assumptions of the institutions, museums, academic disciplines, popular media that have mediated between the ancient evidence and the modern public. And one of the consistent patterns in that mediation is the emphasis on the most dramatically visible achievements: the pyramids, the military campaigns, the colossal temples, at the expense of the quieter, less immediately dramatic achievements that require more careful attention to the evidence to appreciate. Merneith's governing authority is precisely the kind of achievement that falls into the quieter category. It does not produce a dramatic building visible from orbit. It does not generate the kind of narrative tension that the assassination of pharaohs or the military campaigns of the New Kingdom generate. It requires the patient reading of seal impressions and tomb layouts and subsidiary burial counts to establish. And it challenges a prior assumption, the assumption of male governance, that has been so deeply embedded in the scholarly framework that challenging it requires the specific intellectual effort of first recognizing the assumption as an assumption. This is not easy work, and the fact that it has been done, that the scholarly literature has over the past several decades progressively moved toward the governing authority interpretation of Merneith's evidence, represents a specific achievement of the scholarly tradition's self-examination. The tradition has looked at its own prior assumptions and found them wanting. The tradition has followed the evidence to the most direct conclusion, rather than continuing to accommodate it within a framework that the evidence has outgrown. This account is the popular expression of that scholarly achievement. It translates the scholarly consensus into the form that the popular understanding of the ancient world can absorb, and it does so with the specific directness that the evidence demands and that the prior accommodation had prevented. The deeper truth about Merneith is the truth about the evidence and what it shows. The evidence shows a woman who governed. The truth is that simple. And the simplicity of the truth, after more than a century of complicated accommodation, is itself remarkable. She governed. The deeper truth is the recognition of what that means for the history of the ancient world, for the history of female authority, for the specific story of the Egyptian civilizational tradition that this series has been tracing, for the history of the ancient world, the earliest literate civilization recognized and institutionally accommodated female governing authority from its very beginning. The ancient world was more complex in its distribution of governing authority than the popular imagination has assumed. For the history of female authority, the story of women in power in the ancient world begins earlier and is more consistent in its institutional character than the conventional narrative of occasional exceptional female rulers suggests. For the story of the Egyptian civilizational tradition, the tradition's first governing authority whose gender challenges the standard narrative was not Hatshepsut, with her male royal regalia and her deliberate erasure, but Merneith, quietly, institutionally, naturally governing in the gap between two male reigns at the very beginning of the tradition's history. The deeper truth is the beginning. Merneith is the beginning, and the beginning, properly understood, changes everything that follows. Let that sink in. If the story of the Egyptian tradition's relationship to female authority begins not with Hatshepsut's dramatic transgression of the normal order, but with Merneith's natural institutional expression of the logic of succession management, if the earliest expression of female governing authority in the tradition was not exceptional but normal, then the story of subsequent female rulers looks different. It looks less like the story of exceptions to an immutable rule, and more like the story of variations within a tradition that has always had the institutional capacity for female governance. The tradition had the capacity from the beginning. Merneith expressed it. The following 3,000 years of the tradition's history are the story of how that capacity was sometimes exercised and sometimes constrained by the specific institutional and political circumstances of each period. That story begins here, with Merneith, with the tomb in the desert at Abydos, with the evidence that has been waiting for its full recognition. The recognition is given. The deeper truth is complete. The implications follow immediately. The grief in Merneith's story is specific and particular. It is not the dramatic grief of a civilization ending or the poignant grief of a great achievement built just before the descent. It is the quieter, and in some ways, more troubling grief of systematic under-recognition. The grief of a story that has been present in the evidence for more than a century and has consistently been told in the way that minimized, rather than recognized, what the evidence shows. The grief is not Merneith's personal grief. She ruled. She was recognized in her time, in the most permanent institutional vocabulary available to the tradition. The tomb at Abydos is the evidence for that recognition. The subsidiary burials are the evidence for it. The sec on the seal impressions is the evidence for it. The grief is ours. The grief of the modern world that has had the evidence for more than a century and has been too slow to read it in the full force of what it shows. The grief of the generation of scholars who worked with the evidence and were too deeply embedded in the prior assumption to follow it to its most direct conclusion. And the specific grief of knowing that the most direct conclusion was available the entire time. In the material that Petrie documented and published in 1900 CE, waiting for the specific intellectual willingness to follow the evidence rather than the assumption. The willingness is now present. The grief is acknowledged, and the recognition that the acknowledgement enables is the recognition this account delivers in the closing. She governed. The grief of her systematic under-recognition is the complement of the recognition she deserves. Both are real, both are part of the full truth. The implications follow, and then the closing, and then the name, spoken in its full force. The full accounting is almost complete. The full accounting requires one final element in the deeper truth section: the specific connection between Merneith's story and the arc of this series. This series has been tracing the story of Egyptian civilization from the First Dynasty through the Late Period and the Ptolemaic synthesis. Each account has examined a specific individual at a specific moment of civilizational significance, and the pattern that emerges across the accounts is the pattern of institutional intelligence deployed at critical moments to maintain, advance, or restore the tradition. Merneith's specific moment was the succession crisis of the Djet transition. Her specific institutional intelligence was the recognition, or rather the natural expression, of the logic that made her the governing authority during the transition, and her specific contribution to the tradition was the maintenance of the institutional infrastructure that Den inherited and built upon. In this context, Merneith's story fits the pattern of this series not as an exception, but as an expression. Another individual, at another critical moment, deploying specific institutional intelligence in the service of the tradition's continuity. The fact that she was a woman doing this in a tradition that would later formalize around male succession does not make her exceptional within the series pattern. It makes her a specific expression of the most fundamental insight the series has been working to convey: that the continuity of civilizations is maintained by specific human beings at specific critical moments, and that those human beings come in all the forms that humanity produces. She was there at the beginning. She maintained the tradition at its most vulnerable early moment. She passed the inheritance to Den intact, and Den built on it to become the most administratively innovative pharaoh of the First Dynasty. The deeper truth is complete. Her contribution to the tradition is recognized. The implications follow. The implications follow now, and they are substantial. The story of Merneith has implications not just for the understanding of the Egyptian First Dynasty, but for the broader understanding of how civilizational traditions develop their institutional forms, and how those forms accommodate or constrain the full range of human capacities for governance. The implications begin with the most immediate, the specific revision of the popular understanding of the Egyptian First Dynasty that the recognition of Merneith's authority requires. The First Dynasty is conventionally presented as a succession of male pharaohs, Nama, Aha, Je, Den, Ka'a, governing in an unbroken patrilineal sequence. The evidence for Merneith's authority requires that this presentation be revised. The sequence was not unbroken, and the gap between Djet and Den was filled not by simply waiting for Den to grow up, but by the specific governing authority of the woman who connected the two reigns. The revision is not dramatic in the sense of requiring wholesale reconstruction of the First Dynasty's history. Most of what is known about the period remains valid. What changes is the specific picture of the succession, the addition, between Djet and Den, of the governing authority of the woman who maintained the state during the transition. The deeper truth section is complete. The full truth is stated. The implications follow immediately in the next section. The revision is important. The implications section develops it in full. But first, a final observation about the deeper truth that captures the most essential thing this account has argued. The essential thing is this: the prior assumption that male governance was the natural and universal form of governance in the ancient world, an assumption so deeply embedded in the scholarly tradition that it operated as an invisible filter on the interpretation of the evidence, is not supported by the evidence. The evidence shows a different picture, a picture in which female governing authority was recognized, institutionally accommodated, and expressed in the specific vocabulary of the pharaonic tradition from the very beginning of the tradition's existence. The picture is more complex than the prior assumption allowed. The truth is more interesting than the assumption. And the recovery of the truth, the specific work of following the evidence to its most direct conclusion, rather than accommodating it within the assumption, is what this account has been doing from its first words to its last. The deeper truth is named. The implications follow. The closing delivers the recognition. 4,900 years after she governed Egypt, more than a century after the evidence for her governing was first recovered from the desert, the recognition is given. the truth is told. Her name was Merneith, and the deeper truth about what her name means is now fully stated. Fully stated. The naming is complete. The accounting is nearly done. The implications section completes the recognition. The closing delivers it. The recognition is, she governed Egypt. The truth is, the evidence has always shown this. The naming is, Merneith. The accounting is, 4,900 years of governing authority, more than a century of systematic under-recognition. And now, finally, the full recognition that the evidence demands. 4,900 years, more than a century. And now, the implications follow. The closing delivers. The name is spoken in its full force, and the full accounting is complete. The specific institutional insight that Merneith's case provides about the early Egyptian state is worth restating in its clearest form before the implications section takes over. The early First Dynasty was a state in institutional development, a state whose governing forms were still being worked out, whose succession practices were still finding their shape, whose organizational vocabulary was still in the process of becoming the systematic apparatus that later periods would inherit. In this context of institutional fluidity, the natural logic of succession management, the logic that pointed to the Queen Mother as the governing authority during a minority succession, was expressed in the full institutional vocabulary of the developing pharaonic tradition. The Serek, the subsidiary burials, the royal tomb, the Saqqara cenotaph. Each of these was the early Egyptian tradition, applying its developing institutional vocabulary to the specific reality of Merneith's governing role. She governed, and the tradition found the institutional vocabulary to recognize and express that governance in the most permanent available medium. This is the specific institutional insight that the pharaonic tradition, in its earliest and most fluid phase, had the capacity to express female governing authority in its own specific vocabulary. That capacity was real. Merneith exercised it. The evidence preserves it. 3,000 years of subsequent Egyptian institutional development progressively formalized the succession rules in ways that constrained this capacity, that made female governing authority less immediately expressible in the institutional vocabulary of the tradition, not impossible but more exceptional, more dependent on specific dramatic circumstances, like Hatshepsut's unusually strong position, or Cleopatra's specific dynastic situation. But the capacity was always there, dormant in the institutional logic of the tradition from the very beginning. Merneith was its first expression, and the recognition of her authority is the recognition of that foundational capacity, the acknowledgement that the tradition was capable of female governance from its very first generation. This acknowledgement matters. Not only for Merneith personally, she has been dead for 4,900 years and has no need of our recognition, but for the understanding of the tradition she helped to found, and for the understanding of the full range of human institutional forms that the ancient world developed. The full range includes female governance. The evidence says so. The deeper truth acknowledges it. The implications follow now, and they are the final steps before the closing delivers the recognition in its most complete form. Section 6. Implications and Reflection. The story of Merneith has implications that extend beyond the specific question of her personal authority and her specific place in the history of the Egyptian First Dynasty. It raises questions about how historical knowledge is constructed, how prior assumptions shape interpretation, and what the full story of the ancient world looks like when the evidence is followed to its most direct conclusions, rather than accommodated within frameworks that were never designed to accommodate it. The first implication is about the practice of historical reconstruction itself. The Merneith case demonstrates, with unusual clarity, the specific mechanism by which prior assumptions can shape historical interpretation without being recognized as doing so. The scholars who interpreted Merneith's evidence within the Queen Mother framework were not being dishonest. They were applying the interpretive habits of their tradition to evidence that those habits were not fully equipped to interpret. The result was an interpretation that was internally consistent within the existing framework, but that required more tortured accommodation of the evidence than the direct reading would have required. The lesson is not that scholars should abandon their frameworks. Every interpreter works within frameworks. There is no interpretation without a framework, and the attempt to interpret evidence without any framework at all is simply the attempt to interpret evidence without the conceptual resources that interpretation requires. The lesson is that frameworks should be held provisionally rather than as fixed backgrounds, that the encounter with evidence that challenges a framework should be an occasion for examining the framework rather than for accommodating the evidence. The Merneith case is a case in which the examination was delayed for more than a century. The examination is now happening. The convergence of the scholarly literature toward the governing authority interpretation represents the specific moment when the Merneith evidence is finally being read without the filter of the prior assumption, and the result of the examination without the filter is the conclusion that this account has been arguing. She governed. The second implication is about the specific history of female authority in the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The series of accounts in this series has examined a range of significant figures across the 5,000-year arc of Egyptian civilization, and the story of Merneith adds a specific dimension to that examination. The earliest documented example of female governing authority in the tradition, understanding that dimension, understanding that the tradition's relationship to female authority began not with the dramatic exceptions of Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, but with the quiet, institutionally natural exercise of governing authority by Merneith at the very beginning of the tradition, changes the character of the story. It is not the story of a tradition that occasionally, exceptionally, permitted women to govern in special circumstances. It is the story of a tradition that recognized female governing authority from its very beginning, that incorporated it into the specific institutional vocabulary of the pharaonic tradition in the form of the Queen Mother's regency, and that the subsequent development of more formalized succession rules may have constrained rather than created. The tradition did not become more open to female authority over time. It started open in the specific way that institutional fluidity permits, open in the way that the natural logic of succession management permits, and became progressively more constrained as the formal rules of succession became more rigid. Merneith is the evidence for the opening. The 3,000 years of increasingly formalized succession rules that followed her are the evidence for the constraining, and the occasional female rulers who appear across that 3,000-year history. Hatshepsut, Nefertiti's possible brief rule, Tuzut, Cleopatra, are the evidence that the constraint was never absolute, that the natural logic of succession management could still, under the right circumstances, produce female governing authority, even in a tradition that had developed formal rules designed primarily around male succession. The third implication is about the broader question of who governs in the ancient world and how the memory of that governance is transmitted. The history of ancient governance, the specific record of who held power, how they exercised it, and how the memory of it was preserved and transmitted, is inevitably shaped by the specific character of the documentary traditions through which it reaches us. The king lists, the administrative records, the literary texts, the monumental inscriptions, all of these were produced by specific institutions with specific institutional perspectives, and all of them reflect, in various ways, the specific assumptions and interests of those institutions. The Egyptian king lists, produced in the New Kingdom and in the Ptolemaic period, compiled to establish the specific lineage of the ruling pharaoh within the long succession of the tradition, had a specific interest in presenting that lineage as a succession of male rulers. The inclusion of Merneith as a governing authority in such a list would have complicated the specific form of the legitimation that the list was designed to provide. Her absence from the list is therefore not simply evidence that she was not a governing authority. It is evidence that the documentary tradition that produced the list had a specific interest in presenting the succession in the form that excluded her. Understanding the interests that shape documentary traditions is one of the most important skills in the practice of historical scholarship. The Merneith case is one of its most instructive examples. The absence from the documentary tradition tells us as much about the tradition as it does about the absent figure. She was absent from the later king lists. She was present in the ground at Abydos. The ground is the more reliable witness. The arc of this series, from Den's founding moment to Khasekhemwy's hinge, from Userkaf's solar temple founding to Nusera's artistic summit, from the late period pharaohs to the Ptolemaic synthesis, has been tracing the continuity of the Egyptian civilizational tradition across 5,000 years. Merneith's story fits this arc in a specific and foundational way. She is the figure who maintained the tradition at its most institutionally vulnerable early moment, the person who governed during the transition that could have disrupted the institutional development of the First Dynasty, but did not. The maintenance she performed, the specific governing activity that kept the administrative apparatus functioning, the royal estates managed, the institutional relationships of the court operational, is the quiet work of continuity that every great tradition requires at specific critical moments. It is the work that does not generate dramatic monuments or celebrated literary traditions, but that makes the dramatic monuments and the celebrated literary traditions of subsequent generations possible. Den's administrative innovations, the nome system, the vizier's title, the standardized administrative labels, were built on an institutional foundation that was intact when he took full independent control because Merneith had maintained it during the period of his minority. The foundation was intact because she governed. The governing was real because the evidence shows it to be real. This is the specific implication for the arc of the series. Merneith was the foundational figure who made the institutional development of the First Dynasty's most innovative period possible. Without the maintenance of the institutional foundation during the transition from Djet to Den, the specific innovations of Den's reign, the innovations described in detail in the account devoted to him in this series, would have been building on a potentially disrupted foundation rather than a maintained one. Merneith maintained the foundation. Den built on it. The arc from the foundation to the First Dynasty's administrative peak is the arc from Merneith's governing period to Den's active rule, and that arc is one of the most important institutional developments in the earliest phase of Egyptian civilizational history. The implication for the broader understanding of institutional continuity is clear. The most important contributions to a tradition's continuity are not always the most visible ones. The maintenance work, the quiet, institutionally essential activity of keeping the machinery running during the transition periods, is as important as the building work, sometimes more important, because without the maintenance, the building is not possible. Merneith did the maintenance work. The tradition was built on it. The recognition of that maintenance is the recognition of the most foundational contribution to the Egyptian tradition that a woman made, not the dramatic later exceptions of Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, but the quiet, institutionally essential, foundational maintenance of Merneith at the very beginning. The second major implication of Merneith's story concerns the specific pattern of historical recovery, the process by which the evidence for her authority has been recovered, interpreted, debated, and gradually accepted by the scholarly tradition over the past century and more. The pattern of recovery is itself instructive. The evidence was recovered by Petrie in 1899. The initial interpretation minimized the governing authority dimension of the evidence. The subsequent decades saw a gradual accumulation of additional evidence and a gradual refinement of the scholarly analysis. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw the convergence of multiple scholarly traditions toward the governing authority interpretation, and now, in the popular account that this series represents, the convergence is expressed in the form accessible to the general audience. This pattern, archaeological recovery, initial conservative interpretation, gradual scholarly refinement, eventual convergence toward the most direct reading of the evidence, is the normal pattern of historical recovery for any sufficiently challenging piece of evidence. What is specific to the Merneith case is the particular nature of the challenge to prior assumptions about gender and power, rather than simply the challenge of fragmentary or ambiguous evidence. The pattern of recovery took longer than it might have taken for evidence that challenged a less deeply embedded assumption. The convergence has been slower, but it has happened. The scholarly tradition has done its work of self-examination. The evidence has been followed to its most direct conclusion, and the recognition is now available to the general audience in the form this account provides. The third implication concerns what Merneith's story means for the understanding of the ancient world's full complexity, for the recognition that the ancient world was more varied, more institutionally sophisticated, and more open to the full range of human capacities for governance than the popular historical imagination has typically assumed. The popular imagination of the ancient world tends toward simplicity, toward the idea that ancient societies had rigid, simple structures that evolved gradually into the complex structures of the modern world. This tendency toward simplicity is understandable. The ancient world is distant, the evidence is incomplete, and the complexity of any given ancient society is genuinely difficult to reconstruct from the surviving material. Simplification is the natural response to complexity under conditions of incomplete information. But the evidence does not support the simplification. The ancient world was complex. The Egyptian First Dynasty was complex. The distribution of authority in the First Dynasty was not the simple patrilineal succession that the conventional narrative presents. It was a more varied, more institutionally responsive distribution that could and did accommodate female governing authority when the specific circumstances of the succession required it. Merneith is the evidence for this complexity. Her story, told in its full force, contributes to the fuller picture of the ancient world that the evidence supports. And the fuller picture is more interesting, more instructive, and more accurately representative of the actual historical record than the simplified version that has dominated the popular telling. The implications are stated. The closing delivers the recognition, and the recognition, the direct, specific, evidence-based recognition that Merneith governed Egypt, is what the closing now provides. The recognition is, she governed. The evidence is the tomb, the seals, the subsidiary burials, the Saqqara monument. The implication is the Egyptian tradition was capable of female governance from its very beginning. The reflection is the prior assumption that prevented this recognition from being the dominant interpretation for most of the past century tells us something important about how historical knowledge is constructed, and how the assumptions embedded in scholarly frameworks shape the interpretation of evidence. All of these, the recognition, the evidence, the implication, the reflection, are what this account has been assembling. The assembly is complete. The closing now delivers the final form of the recognition. The final form is the name spoken in its full force, Merneith, the woman who governed Egypt, the first female ruler in recorded history, the foundational figure of the Egyptian tradition's capacity for female governance. The closing follows. Section 7. The closing. The tomb is at Abydos. It has been there since the last days of the First Dynasty, when the burial was sealed, and the retainers were killed, and the mound was built over the entrance, and the court moved on to the next reign, to Den's independent rule, to the administrative innovations, and the ivory labels, and the staircase tomb that the previous account in this series described. The tomb waited in the desert for approximately 4,800 years before Petrie arrived in 1899 with his workers and his systematic methodology and his notebooks. It waited while the Egyptian civilization of the Old Kingdom rose to its pyramid-building glory and declined into the First Intermediate period. It waited while the Middle Kingdom restored the tradition, and the New Kingdom carried it to its imperial peak, and the Late Period struggled to maintain it against the Assyrians and the Persians. It waited while the Ptolemies synthesized it with the Greek world, and the Romans absorbed it and the Christians transformed it. 4,800 years of waiting. The desert is patient, the mud brick endures, and when Petri's workers cleared the sand and the accumulated debris from the tomb complex at Abydos, what they found was the evidence for a woman who had governed the most powerful and most institutionally sophisticated state in the ancient world at the beginning of the era of written records. The answer to the title question, who was Merneith, Egypt's first female ruler, is now as complete as the available evidence allows. She was a woman of the First Dynasty of Egypt, ruling approximately 4,900 years ago in the period between the reigns of Djet and Den. She was the wife of Djet and the mother of Den, the specific dynastic connection that placed her at the natural center of the succession crisis when Djet died and the young Den was not yet capable of governing. She exercised the governing authority of the Egyptian state during the period of Den's minority, a period that may have lasted between 5 and 10 years, during which the administrative apparatus of the state was maintained and developed under her oversight. She was buried at Abydos in the royal cemetery in a tomb of royal scale surrounded by approximately 41 subsidiary burials, the specific institutional marker of the royal funerary tradition that placed her firmly within the category of the governing pharaohs whose peer she was. She had a cenotaph at Saqqara, the specific second funerary monument that the First Dynasty rulers built at the administrative capital alongside their burial at the ancestral necropolis. Her name appears on seal impressions from both monuments in configurations, consistent with the administrative vocabulary of a governing authority, including appearances in the Serek enclosure that was the specific graphic marker of the ruling pharaoh's name. Her name meant beloved of Neith, a dedication to the ancient warrior goddess of Sais in the western Nile Delta, one of the most powerful divine presences in the early Egyptian theological tradition, and the patron deity of the city that would become the capital of the last great native Egyptian dynasty, more than 2,000 years after Merneith's death. She was the first documented female holder of governing authority in the history of the Egyptian state. She was, by the best available comparative evidence, among the earliest documented female holders of governing authority in the history of the ancient world, and her story has been available in the material evidence since Petri's excavation in 1899, and has been systematically minimized and qualified in the telling for more than a century since. The minimization ends here. The qualification is addressed. The direct reading of the evidence, the reading that follows it to its most plausible conclusion, rather than accommodating it within a prior assumption, leads to the recognition that this account delivers. She governed Egypt. The tomb is the evidence. The seals are the evidence. The subsidiary burials are the evidence. The Saqqara monument is the evidence. The institutional logic of her position. Widow of the deceased pharaoh, mother of the young heir, the specific person whose connection to both the previous and the following reign made her the natural governing authority in the gap between them, is the evidence. And the evidence, read honestly and without the filter of prior assumptions about who was capable of governing in the ancient world, is conclusive. 4,900 years after the last retainer was killed and buried beside her in the desert at Abydos, the woman who governed Egypt at the dawn of recorded history has her full recognition. Look at the desert at Abydos differently. Walk past Tomb Y, past the low mound that marks the underground structure where she was buried, knowing what it is and who was placed within it. Walk past it as you would walk past the tomb of Den or Djet or any of the other First Dynasty pharaohs buried in the same cemetery. Because that is what it is, the tomb of a pharaoh, the tomb of the woman who governed Egypt. The desert is patient, the evidence is still there, and now, finally, the story is told. Her name was Merneith, beloved of Neith, wife of Djet, mother of Den, ruler of Egypt, and now you know it. 4,900 years of desert patience. The evidence has been waiting in the ground at Abydos since the First Dynasty sealed the tomb and moved on to Den's independent rule. It waited through everything that followed: the pyramid builders and the Sun Temple builders and the great empire of the New Kingdom, and the late period's embattled sovereignty, and the Ptolemaic synthesis, and the Roman conquest, and the centuries of Christian and Islamic Egypt, and the centuries of Ottoman Egypt, and the arrival of the European archaeologists in the 19th century, with their methodologies and their prior assumptions, and their slow but eventual willingness to follow the evidence to its most direct conclusion. The evidence was patient, the recognition was slow, the recognition is now given. The answer to the title question, who was Merneith, Egypt's first female ruler in approximately 2900 BC, is now as complete as the available evidence allows. She was the wife of Djet, the fourth pharaoh of the First Dynasty of Egypt, and the mother of Den, the fifth pharaoh. She exercised the governing authority of the Egyptian state during the period between Djet's death and Den's establishment of independent rule, a period of approximately 5 to 10 years during which she maintained and developed the institutional apparatus of the earliest literate civilization in the history of the Western world. She was buried at Abydos in the royal cemetery in a tomb whose scale and whose subsidiary burials placed her institutional status unambiguously within the category of the governing pharaohs of the First Dynasty. She had a cenotaph at Saqqara, the second funerary monument that the First Dynasty rulers built at the administrative capital. Her name appears in the administrative records of the state in configurations consistent with a governing authority, including the appearances in the Serek enclosure. That was the specific institutional marker of the ruling pharaoh's name. She governed. The evidence says so. This account has assembled the evidence, argued the case, and delivered the recognition. The recognition, in its most concentrated form, is this: a woman governed the most powerful and most institutionally sophisticated state in the ancient world, approximately 4,900 years ago, and the evidence for her governing has been present in the material record since Flinders Petrie excavated her tomb in 1899 CE. The recognition of that governing authority, the specific willingness to follow the evidence to its most direct conclusion, rather than accommodating it within a prior assumption, is what this account has provided. She governed Egypt before the pyramids were built. She governed Egypt before the Book of the Dead was written, before the New Kingdom's military empire was established, before Hatshepsut wore the false beard and Cleopatra wrote in 7 languages. She governed at the dawn, when the tradition she helped to maintain was still finding its forms, when the institution she preserved was still developing the administrative vocabulary that would sustain 3,000 years of civilizational continuity. She was there at the beginning. She governed at the beginning. And her governing was recognized in the specific institutional vocabulary of the beginning, in the most permanent medium available: the tomb in the desert, the subsidiary burials, the seal impressions, the name in the Serek. The desert is still patient. The tomb is still at Abydos. The seal impressions are in museum collections. The evidence is real, recoverable, and clear enough for the recognition it demands. Stand in the desert at Abydos. Walk past the low mound of Tomb Y. Know who was buried within it. Not a consort, not simply a honored mother, but the woman who governed the Egyptian state during the gap between 2 male reigns, who maintained the institutional inheritance that her son would develop into the most administratively innovative reign of the First Dynasty. She governed. She was recognized. She was buried among the pharaohs because she was one of them, in function, in institutional recognition, in the permanent material vocabulary of the tradition she helped to sustain. Her name was Merneith, beloved of Neith, Egypt's first female ruler, the woman who governed at the dawn of recorded history, and now you know it.